December.
Okay, so for the record, Anthea Dexter Cooper from the Office of Legislative Counsel, seeing a quorum of the members of the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules present, but neither the chair nor the vice chair. I'm calling this meeting to order. And the first order of business will be to elect a chair pro tem to preside over the meeting. Before I do that, I just wanted to mention that I heard from Senator McDonald and he sends his apologies for not being able to be here today. So are there any motions for an individual to serve as the chair pro tem? Representative Bungartz.
I move that Senator Bray chair the meeting today in pro tem capacity.
Are there any other nominations? Seeing none, all those in favor of Senator Bray serving as chair pro tem for the meeting, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? The meeting is yours, sir.
All right.
Should we mention that Senator Lyons, as I understand it?
Yes, so Senator Lyons is present and participating in the meeting, fully able to vote. Hello, Senator Lyons.
Okay.
Good morning. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be able to vote.
And move over one seat so I can.
How are you feeling, Senator Lyons?
Terrific.
Good.
Just a little tincture of time and everything will be great.
So happy.
Thank you and good morning. So for people who are following the session, we have the unusual situation of having both the chair and vice chair not present. So I'm happy to sit in and serve in that capacity today. Let's start in our usual way, which is to have introductions. If we could start with Representative Higley, then we'll go around the table and then to the screen and our colleagues here in the room.
Yes, good morning. Representative Mark Higley from Lowell. I currently represent Lowell, J. Westfield, Troy, and the town of Eden.
Morning. My name is Carol Odie, and I represent the far new north end of Burlington.
Good morning. Seth Blongott, I represent Bennington 4, which is constituted of the towns of Arlington, Sandgate, Manchester, and a sliver of Sunderland.
A sliver? It got smaller. I am Joe Benning. I represent the Caledonia Senatorial District, which presently is all of Caledonia County and the 6 northeasternmost towns of Orange County, and will soon be much smaller.
By Zoom today, we have Senator Lyons.
Oops.
Good morning. Senator Ginny Lyons representing Chittenden Southeast, which is its own little district now.
Okay.
I actually currently represent all of Chittenden County, but Chittenden Southeast coming up.
Thank you. And as council has noted, although we don't always have members of the committee allowed to participate and vote remotely under joint rules, Senator Lyons has that authority to do that today.
Yep, 22A.
And so also if we can do our staff that helps LCAR run, so starting with council.
So Anthea Dexter Cooper, already introduced myself, Office of Legislative Counsel.
And
Charlene Dindo, Committee Assistant.
Lindsay Fryer, Administrative Assistant.
great. And my name's Chris Bray. I live in Bristol. I'm one of the 2 Addison District Senators and happy to be with you all today. So we have some rules to take up and some of these are familiar. They're ongoing discussions. So let's start with, we have the minutes to approve from the prior meeting. Thank you, Representative Odie. Are there any discussion over the minutes or their approval? Hearing none. All those in favor of adopting the minutes, our meeting on sorry, I didn't see the date, the 3rd.
Yeah.
From November 3rd, please say aye.
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 Thank you. So our minutes from the 3rd are approved. And moving to our first rule, 22E15, Department for Children and Families Transitional Housing Program Emergency Rules, which we've been discussing previously. We have one witness scheduled, Ms. Moreau, Good morning.
Good morning. I'm Heidi Moreau, a policy advisor for the Department for Children and Families, and I'm joined today by Nicole Tousignant, the Policy and Operations Manager for DCF's Economic Services Division.
Thank you. So there have been ongoing discussions about this rule, and from the agency side of things, if you could fill us in where you're at, that would be helpful for the committee.
Okay, I'm going to pass it off to Nicole to summarize that for you.
Good morning. So the rule did go into effect on...
Ms. Tousignant, could you please just introduce yourself for the record? Thank you.
Yes, I can. Hi, I'm Nicole Tousignant. I am the Policy and Operations Director for Economic Services Division of DCF. So I oversee the program teams, including the General Assistance Team. And so we work to administer the rules that are in place. The rule in question did go into effect on October 1st, and the two main changes were the stopping of new applications, as well as an administrative cap on the amount that could be charged under an occupancy agreement by a hotel. So that did go into effect on October 1st.
And sorry, there have been discussions with the Joint Fiscal Committee about this rule. Is that correct?
Not about the rule specifically, about how we're utilizing emergency rental assistance program funding and what programs we have in place. So we did release earlier this week the adverse weather conditions policy, which allows for expanded housing under the general assistance emergency housing program, which covers the same population of individuals that were covered under this emergency rule.
Okay, thank you. And there were a number of objections raised to the rule. Some of it was really I think basically boiled down to the notion that the rules constituted a policy decision as opposed to just an implementation of legislative intent as already expressed by the legislature. There was also a question about how funding might be developed and supported for the program. So that's been, I think you've now participated in 2 rounds of discussions with Joint Fiscal. So that work is ongoing. And then Senator Lyons' committee, Health and Welfare, as well as the House counterpart, is holding a hearing. So Senator Lyons, could you say something about the hearing you're planning to hold and how it relates to our review of this rule?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, tomorrow morning, the House Human Services Committee, along with the Senate Health and Welfare Committee, policy committees involved in this, in the legislation and decision-making, are meeting along with some members of economic development in the Senate and government operations in the House. And members of the Senate Appropriations Committee have also been invited. I don't know that any of them can attend, but at least one member of Joint Fiscal will also be in attendance. The goal is to listen to folks who have concerns about the rules as they are written and to understand what, if any, decisions have been made about the allocation of funds, policy decisions about allocation of funds, so that we can make recommendations in particular to both LCAR and I would say either or both LCAR and Joint Fiscal Committee. So that meeting is happening tomorrow, and it might be, I think, appropriate and also prudent to wait until that meeting has taken place before we make a final decision on the set of rules.
Thank you, Senator Lyons. It's also my understanding that Joint Fiscal has asked the agency to come back with more information in terms of how it might support the rule, how basically the financing for the program. So with that in mind, it would seem as though there are enough, as Senator Lyons has said, there are enough issues in play still waiting to be resolved that it'd be, my sense is it would be prudent for us to postpone action. But I want to pause and ask, are there any committee questions for our witnesses or anything you would like to raise with council or Senator Lyons to help fill out the story before we take any action on the rule? Representative Bodie.
Thank you. Well, I had asked last time, if we stop new applications, then we stop any data collection about people who have new needs, maybe people who first are moving to the state, maybe people who didn't know about it first. So that is something that I hope that will be discussed upcoming. And I can see that from Senator Lyons that it will be. So I'm very happy about that. Thank you. That's my concern. And do you need a motion to postpone?
Yeah, but thanks for raising that question. Ms. Moreau, although the rule proposes, a cutoff of October 1st, are you still, is the agency still accepting applications, or even if you're not formally accepting, are you tracking people who would like to apply for the program and developing a list, something along those lines? Can you fill us in on that side?
I don't believe so, but Nicole, could you provide more detail on that?
So the department is not accepting new applications for the program, and we also aren't doing data collection. However, I would like to point out that the population served by the adverse weather conditions policy overlaps with the transitional housing program. And so the majority of people that could be entering through the transitional housing door are now coming in through the adverse weather condition policy door.
Okay, thank you. Any other committee questions or discussion?
Just one more question. Is there any population that's left out? That's
With adverse weather conditions, the income criteria is slightly different. Under the transitional housing program, the eligibility criteria is 80% of area median income, which is higher. We estimate there's about 100 people who are currently in the transitional housing program that would not have qualified for adverse weather conditions because of their income.
Okay.
And I'm going to just push it one question further. Would there be any problem with having a notice on the website or wherever people apply to say, we will not take action on any applications. Please do continue to submit applications so we can gauge the need and gauge who is still out there needing.
We could discuss that internally, yes.
Okay, thank you, Representative Bodie. Anyone else? Okay, so welcome a motion to
move to postpone action on this item.
Our next meeting is scheduled for December 1st. Is that correct? Okay.
For December 1st.
Okay. So the motion then is to postpone action on Rule 22E15 until our next meeting, which is December 1st, 2022. Any further discussion? Okay, hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Opposed, nay? Okay, so motion carries. And we'll thank you, Ms. Moreau, Ms. Tusanan, for coming in, and we'll hope to see you on the 1st.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, I would like to move forward to a collection of rules that we have in front of us. 22 P14, P15, P16, P17, and P18, which I think we need to handle in terms of if we're moving forward with votes individually as individual votes, but like to have the rules introduced as a group, and looking to Ms. Berliner to help us get started on this morning. And I'm looking to see on the screen. There she is.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can. We don't see video.
Can't see me. There you are.
And now we can see you as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, thanks for having me. I'm Ashley Berliner. I'm the Director of Medicaid Policy at the Agency of Human Services. And want to thank you for your time today off session to review our collection of HBEE rules The HPE establishes eligibility and enrollment requirements for Medicaid, Dr. Dinosaur, and the qualified health plan insurance coverage through Vermont Health Connect. We have been before this committee on this rule before. Since 2014, we've been revising the rule annually, largely in response to newly issued federal guidance under the Affordable Care Act. As a reminder, HBE is a rule with 8 parts, but today only 5 of the parts are being amended in this filing and are before you. Parts 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7. We pre-filed this proposed rulemaking with LCAR on May 20th and went before LCAR on June 13th for a review of the proposed rule. The proposed rule was filed with the Secretary of State on July 7th. A public hearing was held on August 17th. There were no attendees. The deadline for public comment was August 24th. We did not receive any comments on parts 1, 5, and 7. Comments were received on parts 2 and 3. The final proposed rule was filed with the Secretary of State in this committee on October 14th. This rulemaking is necessary to align HBE parts 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7 with federal and state law and guidance and to make technical corrections. It also attempts to include revisions that improve clarity. The revisions include codifying the open enrollment period for qualified health plans from November 1st to January 15th, adding new income-based special enrollment period for qualified health plans that allow ongoing enrollment for those at or below 200% of the federal poverty level, extending the Medicaid postpartum period for pregnant women from 60 days to 12 months, adding compacts of free association migrants as qualified non-citizens eligible for Medicaid and exempt from the 5-year bar. These migrants are citizens of Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and the Republic of Palau. It adds a reference to a standardized eligibility tool for Katie Beckett Medicaid. It expands Medicaid eligibility for former foster care children to include children who are aging out of foster care in another state. And in response to comment, it addresses the ACA's family glitch, which regards affordability of employer coverage consistent with IRS regulation. We've analyzed and evaluated these anticipated costs and benefits from the adoption of these rules, and some of the proposed changes to HBE do have an economic impact beginning in state fiscal year 2023. The estimated gross annualized budget impact includes $2 million to expand postpartum Medicaid coverage for pregnant women from 60 days to 12 months, and roughly $52,000 per year to expand former foster care coverage for out-of-state foster children moving to Vermont. As we've done for the history of this rule, we've communicated with many stakeholders regarding these changes. We've shared the proposed changes with the Medicaid and Exchange Advisory Committee, provided notice of proposed rule through the Global Commitment Register, for which there is a wide range of stakeholders. All of our Global Commitment Register subscribers receive email notifications of the filing, including an explanation of how to be further involved in the rulemaking and public comment process. Some of the rule provisions that are advantageous to Vermonters have already been implemented based on federal timing. And these include the open enrollment extension, special enrollment period, and employer affordability. We've worked closely with stakeholders on development of each of these. And we've also met with the committees of jurisdiction on these changes and have had a separate dedicated meeting with Vermont Legal Aid on the Katie Beckett provision specifically. So I know that's a lot. It's a lot of rules, and we really appreciate your time today. If the rule is approved, we intend to file the adopted rulemaking with the Secretary of State and this committee in December with an effective date of January 1st, 2023. Thanks for your consideration. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Thank you. And just let me check in with you. I know that you are listed as our first witness on it, but there are other Ms. Chapman and Ms. McLemore, who are also from Department of Health Access on our agenda. I don't know if they're coming as seconds if needed, or you're all three of you would like to provide testimony to the committee.
They are reinforcements depending on your
Okay.
questions, but
Right.
if you guys make it easy for me, it'll just be me today.
Okay.
But they're here as the subject matter experts.
It's always good to come with a friend. So with that, any questions from the committee for Ms. Berliner? Representative Bodie.
Thank you. I'm very happy about the extension of Medicaid from 60 days to 12 months for postpartum. And I wondered if someone would elaborate on why that's important.
Yes, so this is an opportunity that was provided for the first time last year, and we are very excited to be taking advantage of the opportunity. Previously, it was just a 6-month postpartum eligibility, and in Vermont, we allow Medicaid eligibility at a higher income if you are pregnant or postpartum. It used to only be for 60 days, but as many of you know, it doesn't automatically get easier at day 60, and allowing for an entire year postpartum to be at this higher income, make sure that the mother and the child are fully covered and are receiving coordinated, consistent coverage is really critical to make sure that they continue to maintain access at this really essential time in baby and family's life.
Thank you.
Senator Benning.
Ashley, good morning. Joe Benning here. This is not my area of expertise by any stretch, so I'm going to ask a basically ignorant question. I noted overall this is trying to align us with federal and state guideline changes. One of the references was to COFA migrants, and then you stated, we back up. The reference to COFA migrants would be specifically that they are being added to the process. Your conclusion later on in the introductory papers was that this would have no economic impact on Vermont from where you stood. I think I heard you say that these migrants are actually residents outside of Vermont. Is that correct?
No, citizens. So they would have to be Vermont residents in order to receive Vermont Medicaid eligibility. And we don't have any COFA migrants known to us today, which is why there is no fiscal impact here. But typically Vermont, or not Vermont Medicaid, federal Medicaid has a exemption for migrants coming to the States and a 5-year bar where they are not eligible for benefits. And so for these COFA migrants who are, compacts of free association migrants from those 3 areas, they would not be subject to the 5-year bar if they were to move to Vermont. And again, there are no known COFA migrants in Vermont at this time. But they would have to be Vermont residents.
Right. So that's why you concluded there was no economic impact.
That's right.
Thank you.
Any other committee questions? I'd also like to check in with Senator Lyons, who's on the Zoom session. As I understand it, as in your role as chair of a committee of jurisdiction, you reviewed the rules and recommended approval to the committee. Is that right, Senator Lyons?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. That the memo from Secretary Samuelson was very clear about accepting some of the concerns and changing the rules based on those concerns. So that was included in my approval sheet. And in addition, I would like to thank the Ms. Berliner in particular and others for setting up meetings with me and other members of the policy committees to review this, because it's quite a bit of work that's gone on, and we should acknowledge the work that has happened to bring this to us. So we did have meetings to fully understand the work and the rules, and so yes, I think we should accept the rules as proposed with those changes to sections 2 and 3, and let them get in place.
Also, looking at the LCAR calendar, our 45-day review period is for all these rules ends on November 28th, which is prior to our next meeting. So it seemed important in terms of moving work forward in a timely way to address these rules at this meeting. So with that, are there any further committee? Well, sorry. Let me go back to our agenda. We also have another witness in the room. So I'd like to invite Rachel Seelig, Director of Vermont Legal Aid Disability Law Project, to join us. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for coming in. If you could just introduce yourself for the record, and your thoughts on the rules in front of us.
Sure, thank you. For the record, my name is Rachel Seelig. I'm Director of the Disability Law Project at Vermont Legal Aid. And most of these rules we think are great and that you should move them forward. The one that we would like to discuss and would ask for you to object or postpone has to do with Katie Beckett Medicaid and the creation of a level of care tool. The tool is referenced in the rule, but the tool has not been published, presented, and there's been no stakeholder input with us other than one meeting where, again, we were not able to see the tool or give any input to it. So our concern here is that there are many reasons for children to need Katie Beckett Medicaid. For those of you where this isn't your area of expertise, Katie Beckett Medicaid is Medicaid for children with significant health needs who might otherwise need to live in a hospital or other institutional setting because they can get Medicaid if they're institutionalized, but their family's income is too high for them to come home and have care in the home. This is a program that was created in the 1980s and is named after a real child, Katie Beckett, who was in exactly that situation. And so we have a number of children in Vermont who need this kind of Medicaid because they otherwise wouldn't qualify. The concern that we have with the level of care tool being in the rule is that without being able to see it, we don't know what it is. It could be entirely arbitrary. We hope it won't be, but we haven't seen it. And we haven't had a stakeholder process about it. And so for those two reasons, primarily, we think that that piece of the rule should either be objected to or to be postponed. I think one of the things that is really complicated for Vermont is that we don't have a lot of institutions anymore. And so a family won't understand what this level of care tool is because they have no concept of what an intermediate care facility is or what a nursing facility for children is, because those don't exist in the state of Vermont. And that will make it really hard for them to understand what this tool even is. I think the other complicating factor is that medical practice has changed since Katie Beckett was a child trapped in a hospital. And so when these families come to us, and we probably have, I don't know, about 10 families a year who've either tried to get Katie Beckett Medicaid and were rejected or have been on it and are being told they're not qualified anymore. So we don't see a problem of the state having trouble with like too many children being enrolled in this program. But we often will look at, well, what would have required this child to be hospitalized or otherwise institutionalized now, or looking back at 1982 before we really had deinstitutionalized. And we have no idea yet whether this tool will address that question of evolving medical standards and whether that would in some way shrink who could be eligible because we have better medical practice today and we have a better understanding today than we did in 1982 of why you might need to be institutionalized or not. Brandon Training School was still open in 1982. And we no longer institutionalize our kids with autism and intellectual and developmental disabilities. But that doesn't necessarily mean they don't need a very high level of care in the community that is comparable to what they would have received at Brandon or today at an intermediate care facility if such existed in Vermont.
Okay, thank you. Representative Higley, then Senator Benning.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So what you're actually asking is to be able to look at what that level of care tool is.
Yes.
And I guess I would ask Ashley what that process would look like working with you.
Yes, thank you. Ooh. I unmuted. I'm on two devices and I unmuted the wrong one. Thank you, and appreciate, Rachel and I have talked about this in the past, and we are very committed to having stakeholder engagement around this rule. The reason it hasn't been seen is because right now it is not, we don't have a rule ready to go and implement as soon as this rule is approved, if it is approved. We have a working draft that we have engaged many cross-disciplinary clinicians on, including private providers, many pediatricians who have Katie Beckett individuals on their panels have weighed in on the tool, psychiatrists, nurse practitioners, pediatricians, family medicine doctors. So we have done an initial round, but it has always been our intention and is absolutely our intention going forward to engage stakeholders once this rule is approved on a final tool. And that tool is something that, as Rachel mentioned, medicine does change. And as there are different standards, our obligation with the federal Medicaid dollars related to Katie Beckett is to ensure that individuals who meet institutional level of care receive Katie Beckett medicated. That is absolutely our motivation here, is to make sure that access is achieved. It was interesting, Rachel, you used the word arbitrary, and that frankly is the reason that we want to bring this tool forward. Is right now the process for determining Katie Beckett eligibility is actually quite arbitrary. It is conducted by contractors who work for the Social Security Administration. And while they have a very detailed, well-vetted tool for determining disability, there is no standard tool that they use for determining the level of care. And Katie Beckett has a two-prong eligibility test. That first test is, are they disabled? Again, the Social Security Administration has a very clear tool for determining eligibility. It is rigorous, it is standardized. Anyone who uses it will be making the same determination regardless of the human using the tool. On level of care, many states have tools, if not all, but every state that we've queried have standardized tools that determine clinical medical necessity for level of care at an institution. In Vermont, that tool does not exist today. It is decided by an individual Social Security Administration contracted worker, and it changes depending on who the worker is, depending on the level of information that is coming in from care teams. And it is really inconsistent. And frankly, it's really confusing for families and providers. And we've heard this from a lot of families and providers that they don't understand why their neighbor or their friend's kid is on Katie Beckett, but they were denied. Or why is my kid on Katie Beckett when my friend's kid was denied? So it's quite arbitrary today, and we absolutely want to be transparent, which is why we're here now, putting it in rule. We do not need to put clinical assessment tools in rule, and this is something that we use really consistently, and it's the standard across the Medicaid program. We have clinical rules and clinical tools that we have implemented and put in place. They're in broad use. And so this is something that we understand the sensitive nature of this. And so we wanted to be really transparent. We want to make sure that we're having these conversations with legislators because we know it impacts lives. And these are really hard cases. These are really sympathetic individuals. And we want to make sure that we're engaging all the right people, that we're talking to the providers, we're talking with the families, we're talking with Vermont Legal Aid. And we absolutely intend to have a full public engagement process around the tool itself. But the first step is this rule, which will allow us, not allow us, but clarify that we will be using a tool, a standard non-arbitrary tool for determining Katie Beckett eligibility for level of care.
Thank you.
Senator Benning.
If I understand this correctly, though, you are essentially asking us to pass a rule making reference to a standard that is not currently in existence. That while both you, Ashley, and you, Rachel, want to see it in existence and are obviously working to get to the same end, this particular rule that we have in front of us is asking us to approve a notation to something that doesn't exist yet. Am I following that correct?
I would distinguish that this rule is clear that if a tool was established, that we are able to use that tool in determining level of care. It does not dictate the establishment of a tool. It just clarifies that if a tool is established, it will be consistently applied. And this is something that I know I've had conversations with Rachel and with Senator Lyons and other legislators on policy committees about this, but this is something that we started pre-pandemic and having conversations around this. And it's why there's been quite a bit of work in engaging external providers around a draft tool. But obviously the pandemic shifted a lot of things for the agency, and it's something that we've not pursued, particularly as, you know, we've been just trying to make sure that we are doing everything we can to address COVID-19 and the public health emergency. Now that we are in a more stable place, we're really interested in making sure that we have some clarity and consistency here, and we view this rule as the first step in allowing us on the path to actually implement a tool, not the other way around. We are not interested in codifying a specific tool, and that would be really inconsistent with any practice that we have in the Medicaid program today. It in my view, is not appropriate to have a specific tool codified in rule.
Senator Benning.
I'd like to follow up. I don't necessarily disagree with you there, Ashley, about not having a specific tool codified, but we're being asked to make reference to a tool that doesn't exist. So I guess my next question is for Senator Lyons, who's the chair of the Committee of Jurisdiction. Ginny, are you okay with this method of approach? I mean, it just seems odd to me as a lawyer that you would refer to something that doesn't exist. No matter what your intent is eventually, right now it doesn't exist. We're being asked to propose or to pass a rule that makes reference to something that doesn't exist. To me as a lawyer, that sounds a little bit odd. And by the way, I love your new background.
I love it. I love it.
You're definitely grounded in a different, no, you're actually not grounded. You appear lost in space. Previous background.
There you go. I'm lost in space. I think that my family might agree with you. So no, listen, I think the question you're asking is really very important. There are a number of things that we ask the administration to do, such as guidelines and procedures and assessment tools that are referenced both in statute and in rule, but don't have specificity. In this case, I think the concern that is being expressed is how this tool is developed. And so, frankly, I can't tell you what, if any, process we have defined for this type of development. So I don't know that the assessment tool process, procedures, criteria are specifically identified in statute. And so this is something that I would, I guess I'd agree with you. It might be helpful for committees of jurisdiction to look at that process. I'm pretty comfortable with what is happening right now in terms of, public engagement, bringing folks together, looking at working with clinical folks and so on. and working with legal aid with Rachel to build this assessment tool. As time goes on, we would like to ensure that the process that's in place is it continues. So if it changes, if medicine changes and the assessment tool changes, we want to know that the process is in place that will make it work, make all of this work. So this is something I've been sort of struggling with myself, but I'm reassured that the development of this tool, this initial development, is a good process. And I think that what might happen would be a review in a committee, a policy committee, to see what, if any, statutory language might be needed to ensure that all of this is carried on in the future.
Well, I guess I'm prepared to vote for the rule, but with the understanding that this is anticipatory language of a tool being developed. And I'm only prepared to do that because this rule is merely making reference to something that parties are intending to complete. But I agree with Ashley. On the one hand, you don't want to codify the actual rule. I agree with Rachel, on the other hand, that they would very much like to have a rule in front of them before they approve it. But I only see this rule as anticipating something being developed. And that's all it's doing, is referencing that arena of discussion, I guess.
You're right. So I would agree with you on that. I think that, so there's a modicum of trust that we're putting in place when we ask for a tool to be developed. But my suggestion would be to send a letter to committees of jurisdiction and ask them to review the process for the development of the assessment tool. Some of it may be driven by federal statute, and Ashley can answer that question, but a lot of it can be driven by our interest in having full public engagement.
So I see that we have, so I just want to pause and echo back what I'm hearing. There's like two threads to this conversation. One is a process question that Senator Benning's raising about approving something that doesn't yet exist, or referencing a tool that doesn't yet formally exist. And then the second is the public engagement process around the development of that tool. So Senator Benning, I'm wondering if it provides you with any comfort, and I'm looking, and now for people following, it's in section 805.6B, I think I'm in. AHS determines, so I'm recording the language. AHS determines whether the individual requires the level of care provided in a medical institution. AHS may designate a standardized assessment tool, which AHS will use whenever it determines whether an individual requires an institutional level of care. So it's permissive, and that it's may designate a tool as opposed to that it's required. And so I'm wondering if that helps in any way, because it makes it, we're less hardwired to a rule that doesn't yet exist. It's saying they may use it as opposed to they shall. And then I want to go back to the process question after.
Well, Senator, if your question does that make it more comfortable for me, I guess the answer is yes. I just want to flag for the purpose of our current witness that everybody seems to understand. It would be much more helpful to have something in front of you that you knew what was going to be incorporated, obviously.
Okay.
But I still come back to the fact that this is a rule that is simply referencing some other area of conversation that currently hasn't come to fruition yet. As a lawyer, I agree that's weird, but I'm not sure that it should scuttle the rule as proposed, as long as we are all telling you in public and on the record that we understand this process hasn't come to its finality yet.
Okay. So on the process piece, thank you. On the content piece, I'd like to go back to our witness and say, so you've been participating in this conversation. What's your thinking about proceeding with approval of the rule with an explicit level, with an explicit understanding of the sort of public engagement that all parties are discussing here this morning?
I mean, we absolutely want to have a public engagement process, and I think we've started that with a conversation, but not with actually seeing the tool. So that is certainly something we want. In my view, even though we're not asking for the tool to be codified in the rule, to me, it would be much more pragmatic, as Senator Benning was talking about, to introduce this rule when there's a tool for everyone to look at so that we understand what we're talking about, rather than saying, we're creating this thing, you haven't seen it yet. Some doctors have seen it across the state. That's good. But it's not finished. It hasn't been validated. We don't know, what it looks like. It would make a lot more sense to me for those two things to come together. And this is not the first time Legal Aid has come here in a situation like this. Several years ago, it was about creating a tool and having a rule reference a tool for children who need high-tech nursing. We've talked about this when it comes to children's personal care services. We've talked about it around the tool for developmental services, right? This is something that does come up over and over again. And our position continues to be, let's have the tool and have that be part of the discussion when we are creating a rule that's going to reference a tool.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Berliner, so I wanted to get back to you and ask you for any reactions you had to the conversation as we keep on going here.
Yeah, I appreciate the line of conversation here. And this is complicated, but at the end of the day, as I was saying, we implement clinical tools all the time, every day. Our practice in Medicaid is to use clinical criteria and evidence-based decision-making to make decisions around, at the code level, what is and isn't covered, and medicine changes, and that is evaluated and changed as science adapts. And we are in front of you today with this particular provision because we want to be transparent about this, because we know that it is a sensitive issue. And so rather than use our authority to implement a tool, which is absolutely within our authority to do, we are really going out of our way to have the discourse, to make sure that we are having the stakeholder engagement, to make sure that it's clear. This is, again, historically, it's been quite an arbitrary process. It's been really muddied by the process. And so we are taking steps today to make sure that it's clear in rule, that the Human Services Board can see in rule that we are doing this, that VLA is able to have a conversation, that we are engaging parents and providers. Everything about this language in front of you today is for transparency. We are not asking LCAR to approve a tool. We are asking you to approve a rule. Please approve the rule. But we are not asking you to approve a tool. And we don't. And it's not something that, that's something we use clinicians for, and we validate and we do stakeholder engagement on, but it is not something that we put in rule and ask for LCAR to approve.
Okay. So I don't want to put words in your mouth in any way, but I want to make sure, I think I'm hearing you say also that you're I suppose, committing on behalf of the agency to have a public process that in the development of that tool. Is that a fair conclusion for me to draw from what you've said?
Absolutely. And we've committed to Rachel and to her colleagues in advance. I've committed to Senator Lyons and to other committees of jurisdiction. This is not something that I'm committing to for the first time today. We are very interested and want to ensure that there is a stakeholder engagement process.
Is it also
rulemaking? Sorry, just one more thing. Rulemaking takes a really long time. And we have included it in this rule with all of our other HBE changes. But the tool needs to have the flexibility to adapt and to change and to be responsive to stakeholder engagement. And that is why we are doing this in the way that we're doing it. I mean, we've had several years of delay because of the PHE to think about process. We did not want to bring a tool to stakeholders and parents that was completely unthought through. You know, we want to have something for them to react to, which is why there is a draft tool today, but it is a draft. There is no final tool. And it absolutely is my strong commitment that there is a public engagement process around that.
Okay. Is there a de facto tool today, even though the rule names, a level of care assessment, tool? Is there a de facto tool right now that this will replace? I mean, somehow this is happening, whether it has a name formally or not. Isn't there a practice that addresses this question of level of care?
The practice right now, as I said, there's this 2-part eligibility test, which is 1, are you disabled? 2, are you at institutional level of care, which is the federal standard and the requirement that we have to uphold. The disabled question is there's absolutely a tool. There's a federal tool that is used on the level of care. It is a question of, do you meet institutional level of care? That is the tool. And so that is subjective. And we are trying to turn this into an objective process where, regardless of what caseworker you get at the Social Security Administration, you're getting the same outcome so that parents and providers can have a better sense of, does it make sense for me to refer this patient to the Katie Beckett program? Or can I be optimistic that my kid is going to get on Katie Beckett because there's consistency across the program? Today, that is not the case. There's not consistency. And we've heard time and time again from providers and even from VLA that there's some confusion around who is and isn't eligible and why. And that is exactly due to the lack of any standardized tool today for that second prong of the test, institutional level of care.
Senator Lyons, you had your hand up before. I see it's down, but do you want to jump in here?
I think I'm fine. I think the conversation is extremely helpful. Thank you.
Okay. I think when we come back to your earlier recommendation to have a letter to committees of jurisdiction, if you could think in the next minute or two what you would want to address in that letter, that'd be helpful. And I'll go back to Representative Odie in the meanwhile. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Ashley, you said that you've brought this to the draft to doctors and other stakeholders. So I just wonder, why not include legal aid in that stakeholder group? Then we wouldn't probably even be having this conversation, because particular doctors may see medical things and they may see particular patients. But you have legal aid here who sees 10 patients, 10 people a year who are impacted. So they might have a higher level look at this, and they're very policy oriented, I would think. So I just wonder, why wouldn't you just include them?
We absolutely will in the next
Didn't
round.
mean will, I meant why don't you?
Oh, well,
now?
I mean, simply because they are not clinicians. This is a clinical tool and it requires clinical assessment, and they are not clinicians. And so this first round, we have only included clinicians. I am the policy director. I have not weighed in on this tool from a clinical perspective because I am not at all equipped to weigh in on this tool from a clinical perspective. I am not a clinician, and neither is Vermont Legal Aid. So there are absolutely roles, and we will be including people who are policymakers, who are attorneys, who are impacted families in the process. But as a first pass, we have only included clinicians. That is the standard. That is the federal requirement, that it be medically necessary from a clinical perspective.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other committee questions? Ms. Selleck, you're still in the chair. So do you have any, I guess my question to you is based on the conversation you've heard and the assurances of inclusion in the development of the tool, does that buy you some greater level of comfort?
Thank you for the question. I think because we have seen this process over and over again, and we come here and we raise it, I think the process piece continues to be a concern for us. I'm not sure that even coming here, I was concerned that the state wasn't going to engage us in a stakeholder process because Ashley had committed to that and she's done that before. And so we have that trust in that relationship between the state and legal aid. I think fundamentally, though, it comes back to that process piece of, yes, I understand it's a clinical tool. We can weigh in on a lot of clinical tools. We're not clinicians, but we talk to a lot of clinicians in our work and we develop expertise by working with our clients and doing the policy work that we do. So obviously, my preference would still be that this will not go into effect until we have the tool. But it is ultimately up to all of you to decide which way to go on this. And I appreciate the idea of sending to the committees of jurisdiction to be able to pay attention to this tool or to this process as other tools are put into rule through reference.
Any other committee questions? Senator Benning.
Thought, I'm sympathetic to your testimony. I'm questioning LCAR's responsibility in allowing a rule to go through that makes a reference to a system that doesn't yet exist. I understand everybody's moving in the same direction, but is it not LCAR's responsibility to say, even if you're making a reference, you make a reference to an anticipated rule as opposed to something that doesn't exist? I mean, I'm no rocket scientist. I'm not expert at all in this conversation. I'm just a small town country lawyer. But Ashley walked me through this. If I'm following the rules and I recognize that a reference has been made to something that is going to get me eligibility for acceptance, and I say to you, all right, where do I find that rule? Right now, as I understand it, you're saying that rule is not in existence. And to me, on LCAR, that leaves me feeling really queasy. I hear people making promises and everybody has good intentions, but at what point does LCAR have a responsibility to say, we don't want to pass this in its present form because it's simply incorrect that you're making reference to something that doesn't exist. And it may be only me that's having that uncomfortable feeling. I said earlier, I'm happy to pass this rule if everybody is on the same train. I'm beginning to wonder if we're actually on the same train. Senator Lyons has her hand up again. I'd love to hear from outer space.
Sure. Well, and I'll loop back to the language of the proposed rule, which says AHS may designate a standardized tool. So I get.
We haven't got a rule to designate. That's the whole issue.
Right. Anyway, it allows for more flexibility than a shall, that part. Senator Lyons.
So, yeah, the word tool probably is getting in our way and we're tripping over it big time. But what I'm hearing AHS say, and I'm sure legal aid would probably agree, that there are standardized ways for making a determination about eligibility for Katie Beckett. If the language said consistent evidence-based determination, we probably wouldn't be tripping over this. It's the idea of having a checklist that is concerning. I'm not sure that a tool is necessarily a checklist, but but what I'm hearing is that it's a consistent evidence-based determination. Now, if you said you may use that'd be really concerning to me. I would want to know that you're absolutely using consistent evidence-based determination for this. So the word tool is, for me, is appropriate at this time. And I would then reinforce what Senator Bray has said about the word may, and also asking committees of jurisdiction to look at the process for this determination and for the development of the tool in this case. So that is just a comment, but it is a thorny issue. There's no question about it. And the people who are, and the kids who are affected by this, it's just, this is so difficult. And it's one of those places where we wish we could just reach in and help every single day.
All right. Thank you, Senator Lyons. So in terms of can you help us outline what you would, since you'd be would anticipate that your current committee will be a recipient of the letter from LCAR. Can you just briefly outline what you would want to address in that letter, if we're going to move that we add a letter later, and that council will draft for this committee's review at a future meeting?
Yes, I'm hoping that, that Anthea will be able to help, and perhaps Katie McClin, that the committees of jurisdiction review and evaluate how the development of and determination of a tool for placing children in the Katie Beckett program occurs, how that happens. I think it doesn't need to be very a long,
right?
Just simple sentence.
Okay.
No, not simple. That's not a simple sentence. It needs to be a short concept.
Okay. All right. Any further committee questions for any of our witnesses? All right. So I think this is, let me ask council here. The part we're examining right now is in which?
Part 2.
Part 2. Okay. All right. So if there's, thank you, Ms. Seelig.
Thank you very much.
With that, I would welcome, we need to vote each of these rules individually. So if the committee has no further questions or there's no further discussion, welcome a motion to take up the first of these, which is 22P14.
Well, I make that motion that we support part 1, which is 22P014.
Okay.
One of the rules we wanted to note, Secretary Samuelson's.
2 and 3 are, I don't
2 and 3,
remember.
okay. Just want to make sure, okay.
Okay. So that's part 1. So Representative Higley's moved approval of Rule 22P14. Any committee discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. So Rule 22P14 is approved. And let's move on to the one we were just discussing, which is 22P15. So Representative Baumgart, you just referenced a memo, and I want to often amend our motions to include references to amendments or made subsequent to filing that tune the language in front of us. So I don't know if we have formal language to incorporate or not.
My understanding, and Senator Lyons, please correct me if I'm wrong, that the notation on your 2 response memos that it meets statutory requirements with modifications, including in Secretary Samuelson's letter, included in parts 2 and 3, that they had already been incorporated into the rule. And because they had been incorporated to the rule, that was why you were comfortable saying it met statutory authority, not that we needed further modifications.
That's accurate.
So
Not that what was the last?
not that there need to be further modifications beyond what was submitted to LCAR. So I think you can do your standard approval motion, and now the record is clear, both through the written correspondence from Senator Lyons and her agreeing with my summary, that you are appreciative of the changes that were made by the adopting agency is part of what they're bringing to LCAR.
Okay. Thank you for bringing that up, and thank you for clarifying, Ms. Dexter Cooper. So with that, welcome a motion to approve Rule 22P15.
I'll make that motion.
Thank you, Representative Odie. Representative Odie's move that we approve Rule 22P15, listed here as Part 2. If there's no further committee discussion, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay, so that rule is approved. While we're on the topic, since we just had a lengthy discussion about it, we'll come back later to a letter to the committees of jurisdiction to flag the concerns raised today. I guess for the record around the concerns expressed, I want to thank Ms. Berliner on behalf of the agency for explicitly acknowledging the public engagement process to come in the development of that tool. So that brings us to Rule 22P16, the non-financial eligibility requirements, Part 3. Senator Lyons, you have signed off on that on behalf of the Committee of Jurisdiction. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. Any committee discussion on Part 3? Okay. Is there a motion to approve?
So move.
Thank you, Senator Lyons and Representative Odie. So the motion from Senator Lyons and Representative Odie is to approve 22P16. Any committee discussion, further committee discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Okay, so that is passed. Thank you. Brings us to Part 5, which is 22P17. Are there any questions or committee discussion around that portion of the set of rules? Okay. Hearing none, I welcome a motion to approve 22P17.
Make a motion to approve 22P17.
Thank you, Representative Higley. Motion's been made to approve 22P17. Hearing no further discussion, all those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the motion carries. Thank you. And that brings us to the last of these 5, 7, Rule 22P18. Is there any committee discussion or questions on that portion of the rules? Looking for a motion.
So moved.
Thank you, Senator Bennington. Senator Benning.
I was
Always trying to-
That was the greatest town in Vermont because it had the most wonderful name.
Yes. We're all going to move there. Senator Benning has moved that we approve Rule 22P18. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay? All right, we have approved Rule 22P18 as well. Okay. Back at the end of the meeting to discuss the letter, and as is our practice, and thank you to everyone for the discussion on collection rules. And with that, I think we're wrapped up unless there's any other questions about this collection of rules, the 5. All right. Thanks, Ms. Berliner. Thanks, Ms. Seelig.
Thank you very much.
In our agenda, then, that brings us forward to rule, we're running a little ahead, which is always a nice thing to be able to say. We're up to Rule 22P21, Agency of Natural Resources, Vermont Low Emission Vehicle and Zero Emission Vehicle Rules. We have a number of witnesses and like to, yes.
I interrupt. I was under the assumption from Legislative Council that the next one, 22P20, needed to be addressed first because of a repeal of current rule.
Right.
Am I mistaken in that?
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, please.
So you could, as LCAR, deal with either rule before the other. However, and the agency should correct me if I'm wrong on this, they cannot, because the repeal of the existing, I'm just going to call them the car rules. The existing car rules is done through 22P20, so they would need to be effective basically at the same time. So that'll be a logistical thing for them to deal with when they come to actually adopting the rules and saying when they will be effective. But LCAR could take one before the other. And my understanding in the ordering of the agenda was it was thought that 22P21 would be the rule that would require more testimony and maybe analysis by the committee. And that's why it was put earlier in the agenda.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thanks for the question. We have fellow travelers in these two roles, so I want to keep it clear what we need to do. And thanks, Ms. Dexter Cooper. So I think that was my understanding as well, because vehicle rules are really sort of the heart of the change in front of us, that we would start with that subject area first. So with that, and in terms of setting up our review of these, do you have anything else you want to share with the committee as council about the way we're handling these two, or timelines, anything along that?
Nothing beyond what I've provided to you in the written correspondence. It will just talking about some of the dates that are important, and I think you'll hear this from the Agency of Natural Resources in their testimony, is under the Global Warming Solutions Act, there's that December 1 date that uses the phrase adopt and implement. I can't tell you how a court would interpret implement. I can tell you under the APA, adoption takes place. So it's the next step after they either the 45 days have passed or they've responded to an objection or LCAR has approved a rule, then they can go on to adoption. So the December 1 adoption piece, setting aside the implement piece, that could theoretically happen at your next meeting. They could adopt that same day. I know Charlene has told me stories about being handed the adoption, like paperwork at the end of the meeting that the rule was approved at. There's also to get into the model year 26 piece that requires the rule to be effective by January 2nd of 2023. So that is where you're getting your post-adoption. The earliest a rule can become effective is 15 days after adoption. So those are some of the timelines that are floating around out there. And I'm giving you that information from a procedural perspective. We'll also finally say that under the APA, LCAR is 45 days so that you know what you are entitled to under statute in terms of your review period. That gets you to, it's either December 15th or December 16th.
Here we go.
The
Charlene,
that's
26. Oh, sorry.
Charlene, those dates need to get updated.
12/26.
And it's supposed to be 11/16. Yeah. So it's supposed to be November 16th, 2022 for the bottom two rows for the very last page of your agenda.
Okay. Thank you. With that, I'd like to invite our first scheduled witness to join us at the table. And back to where I was. Ms. O'Toole, would you like to come and bring, we always say you can sort of choose your own adventure here. So if more than one of you want to come up at once, please feel free to pull up another chair and you can sort of do it as a team, whatever.
I'll defer to my colleague, Jane Lazarchak, Senator, to go first.
Okay, sure. Good morning, Ms. Lazarchak. How are you?
Great. How are all of you?
Thanks. Thank you for coming in.
Yeah, thank you very much for having all of us. So, morning for the record, Jane Lazarchak. I'm the director of the newly formed Climate Action Office within the Secretary's Office of the Agency of Natural Resources. I'm joined today by Megan O'Toole, who's the Climate Change Program Manager within the Climate Action Office. Deirdre Ritzer, who's the Mobile Sources Program Manager within the Air Quality and Climate Division of the Department of Environmental Conservation, and Rachel Stevens, who's Associate General Counsel for the Department of Environmental Conservation, and she serves both the Climate Action Office and the Air Quality Division. I'd like to start us off today and speak more broadly about the rules and their relevance importance with respect to the Global Warming Solutions Act and the Climate Action Plan. And then I'll turn it over to my colleague Megan O'Toole to run through a summary of the four amendments and new rules proposed today for your consideration. These rules build upon a long-standing framework of regulations in Vermont. They date back to the 1990s to hold auto manufacturers to a higher standard than what is imposed by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. These rules support meeting Vermont's emissions reductions requirements as required by the Global Warming Solutions Act. They are currently the most impactful recommendation being advanced from Vermont's initial climate action plan, which was adopted on December 1st, 2021. They are modeled to support a third of the emissions reductions requirements needed from the transportation sector by 2030. The second emissions reduction requirement put forward and laid out in the Global Warming Solutions Act, the first one being 2025, and then the second more aggressive one of 2030. While the adoption of these rules are required by their inclusion in the Climate Action Plan, these rules again build upon Vermont policy that has been in place for decades. Pursuant to the Vermont Global Warming Solutions Act, ANR is required to adopt these rules by December 1st of 2022 by the nature of their inclusion in the Climate Action Plan. These rules and proposed amendments set standards for auto manufacturers that will reduce greenhouse gas and criteria air pollutant emissions from passenger cars, light-duty trucks, and medium and heavy-duty vehicles, along with the engines that are delivered for sale or placed in service in Vermont. The final proposal will also require auto manufacturers to deliver lower emitting and more electric vehicles to Vermont, a practice that's currently in place with advanced clean cars. They send a clear market signal to auto manufacturers that support the transition to cleaner electric vehicles while also having an overall positive net impact on the economy. These conclusions are supported by robust technical and legal analysis, including economic, public health, environmental, which we've included in the rule package for your review. Even though these requirements are being imposed on auto manufacturers, we understand and expect that there will be indirect impacts on Vermonters. Understanding the significance of this package, the Agency of Natural Resources undertook robust public engagement and coordinated closely with other state agencies to better understand the potential indirect impacts of the rules. Additionally, the Global Warming Solutions Act has specific requirements for public engagement around rules proposed in the Climate Action Plan. They included engagement ahead of filing the rule with the Vermont Climate Council, relevant subcommittees, and legislative committees of jurisdiction. Additionally, the Global Warming Solutions Act specifically required that ANR conduct a portion of our hearings in areas and communities that have been most significant exposure to the impacts of climate change, including disadvantaged, low-income, and rural communities. Environmental justice and equity are central to the design and implementation of these rules. ANR held a 45-day public comment period, which included 6 public meetings throughout the state to meet the requirements of the APA and also the public engagement requirement for the rules adopted pursuant to the Global Warming Solutions Act. The meetings were held in Newport, Manchester, Burlington, Bellows Falls, and Barrie, and we held one virtual-only meeting. We also held an additional event that focused specifically on the medium and heavy-duty rules, including advanced clean trucks, the low nitrous oxide and phase 2 rules. And at this event, we heard from Vermont truck dealers, trade associations, fleet owners, municipalities, and other entities interested specifically in the medium and heavy duty rules, which are new. The meeting was a great opportunity for the Agency of Natural Resources to hear questions and concerns about the rules and provide information to clarify some of the misunderstandings about how the rules will be implemented and impact Vermont. Stakeholder outreach for these rules has also been conducted over the course of several years, both through the Vermont Climate Action Plan development and more broadly through collaboration with other jurisdictions that have adopted more stringent standards through public engagement in their rule process and development. For example, Vermont has participated as a stakeholder in public outreach specific to each of the 4 rules in front of you today, including coordination with auto manufacturers, workshops, listening sessions with environmental justice and equity stakeholders, and workshops with other clean car jurisdictions. as well as members of the public. Vermont works closely to coordinate the adoption and implementation of these rules with other Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states. To date, New York, Massachusetts, New Jersey, Oregon, and Washington have adopted advanced clean trucks. Some have also adopted the low nitrous oxide omnibus, with several others to follow this year. In addition, Massachusetts, New York, Oregon, and Washington are all moving to adopt advanced clean cars 2 on the same timeline as Vermont. Overall, the feedback received during the public meetings and written comments were positive, with individuals citing concerns about the impacts of climate change and hopeful that the new rules will help Vermont be a leader in transitioning to the new transportation technology that will reduce emissions. The agency received 236 written comments in favor of the rules, 27 written comments and concerns opposed to the rule, and over 300 individuals and entities signed on to written comments. Many individuals and entities, while concerned about the impacts of climate change, are also concerned about potential adverse impacts of the rules on Vermonters and specifically Vermont businesses. Many of the concerns raised are beyond the scope of the rules, but speak to the broader issues of electrification of Vermont's fleet. The Agency of Natural Resources has addressed all of these concerns in the supplemental information and the responsiveness summary, and continues to clarify that the most stringent requirements of this rule will not be in place for over a decade, representing a measured and strategic approach to implementation that ensures the necessary infrastructure and feasibility elements to be in place to support the transition to electric vehicles. Consumers and fleets will retain the power to choose the technology that fits their needs, whether it's traditional fossil fueled, hybrid, or electric. I want to transition to my colleague Megan O'Toole to provide you with the summary of the rules before we transition to questions. But I also want to note that she will speak more specifically about changes that were addressed in the rules in response to public comment. I want to close by reinforcing that by adopting these rules, Vermont will take a significant step towards cutting our state's climate pollution roughly in half by 2030 as required by the Global Warming Solutions Act. While the timeline set in place by the GWSA to adopt these rules is aggressive, the rules will not start taking effect until model year 2026, and ANR will continue to reach out to Vermonters to ensure the necessary infrastructure is in place to support this transition.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Any committee questions for Ms. Lazorchak before we go on to Ms. O'Toole? Okay, I have just, every legislator fields lots of questions about, many different things, but one of the ones that's come to me, so it would be helpful, I think, for people who are interested in it, is it correct that the Climate Council, formerly created by the legislature, made a formal recommendation to adopt the rules before us today?
This was a unanimous recommendation in the Climate Council, from the Climate Council and the Climate Action Plan. So all 23 members, including the 8 administration officials, supported the adoption of these rules through their inclusion in the Climate Action Plan.
Okay, and then I think the second thing that is maybe a little bit of a new thing for some people to hear about is, does the adoption of is that recommendation then legally binding upon ANR in order to bring that a rule forward to satisfy the recommendation?
Yes, and I'd be more than happy, the specifics of that, to turn to Rachel Stevens, our general counsel, to answer the details of what would happen if ANR was not to adopt these rules by December 1st.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.
Happy to answer other questions as they come up.
Thank you. With that, move to Ms. O'Toole. Good morning. Good to see you again.
Thank you. My name is Megan O'Toole. I'm the Climate Change Mitigation Program Manager for the newly formed Climate Action Office. So I'd like to briefly review the requirements of each of the 4 rules that we are incorporating into our existing program. And I just want to clarify, and doing this in light of the fact that you just reviewed several rules from the Department of Health Access. And when we say that we're incorporating 4 rules into our existing program, there's just one rule that we're considering in terms of a unique chapter or section a unique chapter of the DEC rules. So the rule that's in your package today encompasses all 4 of these programs into regulatory language. So I just wanted to say that we're talking about 4 programs incorporated into one rule. So yes. So the first rule is called Advanced Clean Cars 2. This rule applies to passenger cars, light duty trucks, and some medium duty vehicles. Vermont is currently implementing Advanced Clean Cars 1, which requires auto manufacturers to make cars that burn fossil fuels to meet certain standards to be cleaner emitting. It also requires that a certain percentage of cars delivered to Vermont to be sold be zero emission vehicles, or as we call ZEVs. A ZEV can be an all battery electric vehicle or a hydrogen fuel cell electric vehicle. Auto manufacturers can also meet their obligations by delivering plug-in hybrid electric vehicles or PHEVs. Advanced Clean Cars 2 is an amendment to our current program, which sets more stringent standards for fossil fuel burning vehicles and also requires that manufacturers deliver an increasing percentage of ZEVs, reaching 100% ZEVs by the vehicle model year 2035 in Vermont. To see the ramp up of this percentage requirement, you can refer to page 4 of the regulation summary document to see how that phase-in timeline will occur. The second rule is called Advanced Clean Trucks, a new rule for Vermont that applies to medium and heavy duty vehicles. This rule is similar to Advanced Clean Cars in that it requires auto manufacturers to deliver a certain percentage of electric, medium, and heavy-duty vehicles to Vermont pursuant to a schedule where the percentage requirements are increased over time. The requirements vary across the different vehicle weight classes, and unlike Advanced Clean Cars 2, fossil fuel trucks are not entirely phased out. And again, you can refer to page 6 of the regulation summary document to see percentage requirements for the different vehicle weight class groupings and the timing of those percentages increasing. The third rule is called the heavy duty low, we call it NOx omnibus rule. This is oxides of nitrogen. NOx is an air pollutant that causes ozone pollution to form, which is harmful to human health and the environment, which is why we seek to control its emissions from not only mobile sources, but also stationary sources in Vermont. This rule applies to medium and heavy duty vehicles and requires auto manufacturers to make heavy duty vehicles and engines that burn fossil fuels to meet certain standards to be cleaner emitting. The final rule is called the Phase 2 Greenhouse Gas Standards for Trucks and Trailers. This rule also applies to medium and heavy-duty vehicles and requires auto manufacturers to make medium and heavy-duty vehicles that burn fossil fuels to meet standards to emit less greenhouse gases. And it also sets engineering and design standards for truck trailers so that they cause efficient operation of the tractors that are pulling them and to emit less greenhouse gas emissions. As Jane mentioned, in all the rules that we're proposing today, the only entities being directly regulated are auto manufacturers. Individuals and other entities will be impacted by the rule, but there are no direct requirements being imposed on anyone other than auto manufacturers. The proposed rule or amendments would take effect in the vehicle model year 2026, which actually begins on January 2nd of 2025. Note that federal law requires that these rules be adopted identical to a program currently being implemented by the state of California via its Air Resources Board. This has been the case since we first adopted the California Motor Vehicle Emission Standards in the 1990s. Therefore, pursuant to the authority in the Clean Air Act, we have limited authority to amend the stringency or the substance of these rules. That said, we did make some minor changes to the rule text in the final proposed version of the rule, and this was in response to some comments that we received, and we interpreted those comments as allowing, and the Clean Air Act as allowing us to make those changes. And I'll review the list of those changes now. We made a minor and non-substantive edit for clarity to the incorporation by reference section in section 40-102 to add to that list a another version of a definition of a low volume auto manufacturer to make sure that we were mirroring the California regulations and including all of those definitions. We allowed auto manufacturers to earn early adoption credits under Advanced Clean Trucks, which is in section 40-106, one model year earlier than was allowed in the proposed rule. So this will have the effect of incentivizing auto manufacturers to deliver more medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicles to Vermont sooner. And by doing that, they can earn credit towards their future compliance obligations. So we see that as a benefit to Vermont in terms of that encouraging auto manufacturers to meet those obligations earlier. We also added a new section to our incorporation by reference table. This is section 1969 of the Title 13 of the California Code of Regulations. This provision is commonly referred to as a right to repair clause and requires that manufacturers provide repair information and make available the necessary tooling to non-dealer repair shops. This requirement ensures that independent technicians will have access to basic information needed to help diagnose and repair vehicles, which further supports consumer confidence in purchasing new and used zero-emission vehicles and levels the playing field in terms of who can have access to important repair information. I'll note, which Anthea mentioned earlier, one procedural note that ANR has decided to move the existing rules for this program from the air pollution control regulations to its own standalone chapter in the Department of Environmental Conservation rules. Another rule you will hear today, the wood heater regulation amendments, includes a strikeout of the low and zero emission vehicle rules as they currently exist in the air pollution control regulations so that they can be moved to this new chapter 40 of the DEC rules. And with that, our team would be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Senator Bennett.
As I understand it, the rules are targeted directly at manufacturers.
That's correct.
Are there any manufacturers in Vermont?
There are no auto manufacturing activities or industry happening in the state of Vermont.
Representative Pingley.
Thank you. You had said that there was no direct requirements on individuals, but what are some of the indirect requirements?
We're not directly regulating, or I guess indirectly regulating any entities or individuals in Vermont.
I guess what I mean by it, and it was mentioned in some of the testimony from folks that supplied some testimony talking about it may be only a requirement for manufacturers, but when you tell a Vermonter they cannot buy a internal combustion engine in 2035, and even if they did outside of the state, they would not be able to register it here. That, I would say, would be maybe an indirect burden, or whatever you might call it, on individual Vermonters.
Sure, I can talk about how that would work. So this rule applies to new vehicles, which we define as vehicles that have less than 7,500 miles on their odometer. And there are a number of exceptions in the rule that I'd be happy to review as well for vehicles that the rule will not apply to. And this includes, certain transfer of ownership situations, like if you inherit a vehicle or if you move from out of state and you bring your vehicle with you. There's also an exemption for certain types of emergency vehicles, things like that. This list is in 40-103 subsection D. That's a list of exemptions. But to speak to your question about, buying a new vehicle out of state, the way that we enforce this program and the way that we've enforced it since we adopted it several decades ago is that we don't allow, and this is pursuant to Vermont law, we don't allow new vehicles that don't meet the standards or aren't certified to meet the standards to be registered in the state of Vermont. So DMV enforces that via their registration program. So this would not apply to, say, if you were to purchase a used vehicle that happened to not be certified, you could still register that vehicle. Vehicles that were delivered for sale under earlier model years. So I'll use a hypothetical, for example, it's the year 2035 And there's a dealership that still has vehicles available on their lot that are the previous model year, that are internal combustion engine vehicles. They would still be allowed to be sold and registered as new vehicles in the state of Vermont because they meet the requirements of that model year in which they were delivered. So there's still, I think, a lot of opportunity and availability for Vermonters, in 13 years from now, to register an internal combustion engine vehicle.
Ms. Lazorchak.
I just want to make a finer point and just stress that the majority of vehicle sales in Vermont are used vehicles. And this applies specifically to new vehicles. And if anything, it's creating a more robust used vehicle market for electric vehicles over the next 13 years. But that marketplace for internal combustion engine vehicles and that used sale base will still continue beyond 2035. So, and Megan or others might know the exact percentage of vehicles that are purchased are used, but it's greater than 50% of all vehicles and that Vermonters buy are used vehicles.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Representative Higley, for that question. So I think that's sort of one of the bigger questions sort of floating out there in the general public's mind, like, will I not be able to buy a car? I think from committee testimony, we've heard that something like 2/3 of the cars purchased in Vermont in any given year are used vehicles, and the average Vermont vehicle stays on the road for something like 11 years. So there's always a lot of used vehicles in our statewide fleet.
And if I may offer regarding the used vehicle market, the passenger car regulations that we're considering here include enhanced warranty and durability requirements for the manufacturers. So by durability, I mean the kind of regulated useful life period of the vehicle that we require the manufacturers to meet. And the warranty requirements will be extended so that consumers have a longer mileage and year period to have any repairs covered. But the durability enhancements will make vehicles more durable and hopefully longer lasting to create a more robust used market.
Senator Benning?
Doesn't that run counter to the intent of actually decreasing our carbon emissions?
Well, it applies to all the vehicles that will be manufactured, including the electric vehicles, to ensure that those vehicles will also be more durable and enhance the used electric vehicle market as well.
But if you are providing case of more rural areas, almost an incentive to purchase a used vehicle, it seemed to me that runs counter to the overall goal, now mandate, of reducing carbon emissions. Am I missing something?
Well, I think the vehicles that will also be produced pursuant to Advanced Clean Cars 2 will be cleaner emitting and more efficient in terms of if they're an internal combustion engine vehicle. So I think, and the durability requirements mean that those vehicles will be required to operate, and by operate, I mean their emission control systems will also be required to operate for the useful life of that vehicle. And the warranty periods, will reflect that. So I think that if that means that consumers will more easily be able to maintain those better emission control systems for the internal combustion engine vehicles that will exist at that point. But as I said, the durability requirements also apply to the electric vehicles, which will create a more robust EV market and will, allow lower income, communities to have better access to electric vehicles, so they might be able to make that choice as opposed to purchasing an internal combustion engine vehicle.
Do you have a follow-up, Senator Benning?
No, I'm just contemplating.
Okay. Representative Bodie.
Thank you. Is there data that shows where more used vehicles are purchased? Are more used vehicles actually purchased in rural Vermont than in?
I don't have that data.
It's at 70% of vehicle purchases are used, and I would Gainer, just a guess that that's pretty ubiquitous across the state for where people live, but we'd be happy to follow up if there's that kind of data that where they're purchased.
Yeah. Representative Higley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You had mentioned that you, through this process, have talked to auto manufacturers. I guess my question is, and I see in California, currently General Motors has said that because of the supply chain issues, there's a real issue with getting these vehicles out there. And so a consequence of that is these vehicles that are out there, electric vehicles, are costing that much more. They're not going down in price. Have you heard that from the manufacturers that you've talked to?
So the supply chain issues are certainly causing problems, not only for the manufacturing of electric vehicles, but I think all vehicles across all weight classes. So I think that burden is that issue is definitely affecting any vehicle manufacturing happening right now. But we are hopeful in our conversations with the auto manufacturers. They've made commitments that they have not appeared to waver on in our discussions with them. And so we remain hopeful that they'll be able to meet those commitments. And I just want to note that in the past, when we've come before this committee with changes to this rule, or even when we initially adopted these rules in the 1990s, our main adversary were the auto manufacturers. They really didn't want to be forced into this lane in terms of improving the technology and reducing emissions. And I'd say today, they're actually one of our strongest partners. And this rule at this point really represents a codification of the commitments that they've made. And it's a much more collaborative process at this point. And that's obviously a very welcome change for us to be working more effectively with them. So I just wanted to note that that's how this has evolved over the last 30 years, and it's positive.
Follow-up, thank you. And just to stress what Megan was just speaking to, and that when these rules first were going into effect, they were seen as market forcing rules. And these are really codifying commitments that states like Vermont and others have worked closely with manufacturers to codify what percentages and scale up that manufacturers expect that they can meet. And then there's also a component that Deirdre Ritzer and others are happy to speak to, I'm sure, around evaluation of the rule in an interim period to ensure that those targets are still expected to be met. And there's a period where we may consider, along with California and other states, a change in the percentage based on the realistic expectations of what the market can provide.
I have a quick question on the number of people affected by not the Vermont rule alone, but that the number of states, I forget the number, it seems like, but 14 more or less that are proposing to be covered by the California rule. Do you know how many U.S. citizens would be covered by this rule once all these rules have come online? I think I'm just trying to help people have a sense of, is Vermont doing something quite unique and we're going our own way, or are we part of a larger group and larger transition in the country?
So 18 states have adopted some version of this package of the zero emission and low emission vehicle rules. And obviously that includes Vermont. The market share in those states makes up, I want to say, over 1/3 of all of the vehicles. And Deirdre's gonna hopefully.
Yeah, so of the states that Megan listed, and hi, I'm Deirdre Ritzer with the Vermont Department of Environmental Conservation, the Local Sources Section Manager. So California plus the states that have adopted the low emission vehicle standards, that represents roughly 35.8% of the US new light duty vehicle sales. And then California plus the states that have adopted the zero emission vehicles standards, that represents just under 30% of the US new light duty vehicle sales.
Okay, thank you very much. Mayor Benning.
Just as a follow-up, does any of those 17 other states enable anyone to bring a suit against the state in the event carbon emissions standards are not met?
Yes. State of Massachusetts for one. is adopting these rules as well. And they have a similar statutory and legal structure, including a similar cause of action provision in the Global Warming Solutions Act.
Do you know if any of those dates for carbon emissions reduction standards that are anticipated to be met on a given date have passed in Massachusetts?
If I could just clarify, Senator, so your question is, do they have the same percent reduction requirements?
Another way of asking it is, has anybody actually been given the opportunity to sue yet as a result of being missing a standard reduction?
Yes, Senator, just staying with the Massachusetts example, the state of Massachusetts was sued for failing to comply with their Global Warming Solutions Act.
Do you know what happened as a result of that?
A court ordered their Department of Energy, Resources and Environment to implement stricter regulations. And in fact, Massachusetts now has a state law that requires them to adopt all these rules that we're talking about today.
Do you know when that happened?
Remember, just want to mention that the statutes are different in terms of text, so while they have the same.
Can you state your name for the record, please?
Sorry, I'm Rachel Stevens. I'm Associate General Counsel representing the Agency of Natural Resources.
Thank you.
I can look up the date of the case. I was just going to mention that the actual statutory language is slightly different between the two Global Warming Solutions Acts. So to the extent you're drawing comparisons, that's just important to know. So just wanted to mention that, but I can pull up the date.
I don't know if we all want to pause for that or go to Representative Higley's question in the meantime.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I served on the Energy and Technology Committee that took 8 weeks of testimony on this. So I think I want to clarify what you just said, because my understanding all along, and we had the Conservation Law Foundation come in, there was not a provision in their current Global Warming Solutions Act that allowed for persons to sue. They sued anyway, regardless. And they boasted of, a number of students in the Conservation Law Foundation got this done. So I think that's an important clarification, that they did not have that provision in their Global Warming Solutions Act.
I agree with you. I think the court interpreted that the Conservation Law Foundation did have a cause of action in that case, but yes.
And thank you, Representative Higley, because this reminded me of sort of the other side of that coin. If Vermont were to fail to move forward on this rule, my understanding, and the lawyers in here to correct me, because I may not be remembering this right, that we would be failing to take action on to meet the requirements of our own law, and that in and of it, that failure to act would constitute an opportunity to bring suit against the state. Is that correct as well?
That's correct. There's two causes of action, and the first cause of action is related to failure to adopt rules consistent with the climate action.
And Ellen and I agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Representative Higley?
I don't want to, take up all the time here, but again, I did serve on that committee. I was one of the 2 no votes initially in the committee. So I do have pretty broad knowledge of what the concept is and was, and representing rural constituency here in Vermont, I have some real concerns. And one of those concerns initially, and reason for a no vote, was this very predicament that we're in now. What you just said makes the case that we cannot do anything about this. We have to go along with whatever is determined. And I believe that to a point, but there is a provision under the law where the General Assembly can revoke rules. Whether or not that would ever happen in this state, that's another situation. But my concerns for my rural constituency is so much of what's happening in California. There's issues with urban areas receiving most of the charging stations. The rural and rental properties are having a real issue with that. There's the grid concern. I mean, I've reached out to Vermont Electric Co-op. There was a open house they had up in Newport. Asked them specifically what is their projection as to where they're going to get the power how much that power is going to cost, and they don't have those answers. And as a matter of fact, since then, I misreported a 10% request by Vermont Electric Co-op, but it's an 8.19%. So it's still concerning to me. Electric rates, especially with the combination of this total electrification that the state is heading down. I have such a number of concerns with this going forward. And I mean, I'm definitely not going to support this for all the reasons that California is going through now, for all the reasons that I believe my constituency, my local constituency, is not going to be able to afford these vehicles, even with the incentives. I know in California, that's another issue. They're running out of money for incentives. It's costing an unbelievable amount. I respect what the Agency of Natural Resources has done. I think even when we passed the Global Warming Solutions Act, the agency came in and said, you haven't given us enough money to do what we need to do. And sure enough, there was during the Budget Adjustment Act, another $1 million included, just to do some of the studies that were necessary. And now, of course, just in the past budget year, there was money instituted for the Climate Action Office. So again, I think that's something was overlooked initially. And me as a legislator, I mean, it's easy. I can understand when there's this much testimony that came in and the ones that say, oh yeah, we got to do it. You know, I own a hybrid now and I want electric to get here and all that sort of stuff. And I can understand it when environmentalists, whether, the environmental groups, whatever it is, come in with, dozens of signatures of different groups. I'm a state representative. I don't have the opportunity to just consider carbon emissions reductions. I have the opportunity and should, as we all should, as legislators, look at the broad picture. And we're not being allowed to do that because of the Global Warming Solutions Act and the unelected Climate Council. I mean, it's frustrating for me to sit here and basically understand what you've just said, that we have no standing in saying we can object to this rule. My understanding is even if we do, you can still go forward with the rule. I don't know where I'm going with this, but just my overall frustration with the Global Warming Solutions Act initially. I mean, I hate to go on here, but again, another issue that I just read about was it appears that on November 14th, the Climate Council approved a proposed transportation recommendation of the Cross-Sector Mitigation Subcommittee. And I mean, I'm looking at this and I'm going, I don't even understand what some of this is. It's a cap and invest to reduce policy covering transportation fuels. What does that mean? That's my job, to understand what that means. And it sounds like it's been approved. Is this going to come through again in another rule that I don't even know what it means as far as, is it actually a carbon tax on fuel again? I mean, they talk about, their disgruntled ability to not have the TCI, Transportation Climate Initiative proposal approved. Is this a substitute for that? And then, of course, they still say in this document that if it becomes viable, they're gonna sign on to the TCI. In testimony, of course, Revvion and Tesla are gonna approve. Revvion has a pickup truck that starts at $70,500 to $90,000 before options. My constituency is not going to be able to afford that. Tesla. Now, I don't know. I can't even find when I get online what a semi Tesla is going to cost. It's anywhere from 2 times the amount. And I noticed that I believe it was the truck and bus testimony talked about that. It's basically a $400,000 vehicle compared to an $1,800 vehicle. $180,000 vehicle. Anyway, the list goes on of people that testified in here, whether it's the Farm Bureau, whether it's, the Association of Food Dealers and Manufacturers, I mean, the list goes on. They have some very real and valid concerns that I don't think there's been a comprehensive answer from the agency for this. And I, again, am not willing to go down this road. Sounds like it's going to happen, but I'm not willing to go down this road with so many unknowns. And I guess I'll just leave it at that and appreciate the time to say that.
And, you know, we all know the provenance of the rule in terms of the Climate Council being created and Global Warming Solutions Act. It had controversy built into it so we have that. We're still living with it. We're still figuring those things out. So happy to have you expressing the bigger picture around the relatively narrow piece of work that we're looking at this morning. Before going to Senator.
For a point of order.
Sure.
I believe we do have to have this conversation, but I'd like to get through the witnesses first, because I think we're sort of jumping the gun on the conversation. We do need to get through all the witnesses. So I'm encouraging this conversation, but just not at this moment.
Okay. So noted that I would like to follow up on a more narrow version of Representative Higley's question. So we know that we're in the midst of a once in a lifetime transition from one energy type to another in order to meet needs of people to heat, travel, et cetera. It's complicated. It's being phased in over a long period of time. We're learning as we go. The technology is changing. Can you say a little bit about how the rule addresses the need and provides an ability for us to monitor change over time and make adjustments, sort of to live and learn as things roll out, so that if there are unforeseen challenges to full implementation 8 years out, maybe along the lines of something that Representative Higley's expressing a concern over, do we have the ability to respond to that in the rule?
Yes, we do, Mr. Chair. We have participated in the past in what are called midterm reviews. And these are reviews that are specifically aimed at evaluating feasibility, applicability, timing concerns related to the regulatory program that Vermont is participating in. And this process is initiated and conducted by the California Air Resources Board. We participate in that process as obviously a very interested stakeholder, as another state has adopted their program. The other states usually do the same, as do the auto manufacturers and other interested parties. So we expect that will take place in the future, and we will participate in that. And obviously weigh in from the perspective of a small rural state, as we usually do try to offer that perspective. And if I may, I just wanted to represent a couple points to respond to your comments, Representative. I think that the reaction that we've heard from many individuals, business owners, fleet owners across the state is a lot of concern about the uncertainty and the very much developing nature of some of the applications of this technology, especially for the medium and heavy duty vehicles. And I think what gets overlooked is what we regard to be a very measured phase-in schedule for this technology. The requirements for the medium and heavy duty rules do not come into effect until model year 2026. And they are a pretty light phase-in schedule, at least when you compare them to the light duty side of the regulations. And they don't even entirely phase out fossil fuel technology. That's not contemplated in this rule at all. So there will still be that technology available, because we very much recognize that there are many applications where electric vehicle technology is not ready. We hope that it will get there in the future, and that there will be battery storage and charging and other technologies that will meet that demand. But I think that the kind of panic about electric vehicle transition, it loses the timeline, the conversation about the timeline, and the fact that we very much recognize that this isn't there yet, but we expect it to get there. And that's what that timeline reflects. And I just also want to mention that the state of Vermont has already, through funding allocated in the transportation bill and other legislative initiatives, our charging network is one of the best in the country on a per capita basis. And when we implement public funds to build charging infrastructure, we focus mainly on rural areas because we understand that that's the market that the private vendors of electric vehicle charging equipment aren't going to focus on. And so that's where we're focusing our public money. We're also focusing our public money on apartment buildings and multi-unit dwelling charging. That's a new program that we've just implemented and that the legislature reauthorized and added funding to last year. So there's a lot of movement going on in terms of focusing on many of the issues that you addressed. So I just wanted to respond to that. Sure.
Thank you. So if there are not more questions for the.
I have a question.
Senator Lyons, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for your presentation. This is very helpful. I'm going to start out with a question about your last comment first, and then I have a couple others. You said that you are reaching out to rural folks, and currently our state has a charger for every 70 people. I think that's the data that's available, 1 to 70. And I don't know how you're going to, I wonder what your goals are for that, how you're going to meet the goals. But as you're talking about the things that you are doing, how much of what you're saying that you are doing is actually is referenced in the rules that we have before us?
These are definitely all, I think, issues that are peripheral to the scope of the requirements of the rules that are before you today. As I mentioned, these are rules that are requiring auto manufacturers to deliver vehicles to Vermont that meet a certain set of standards. But we very much appreciate and acknowledge that there's a lot of other pieces of discussion and initiatives that need to move forward in parallel with these requirements. So to answer your question, Senator Lyons, charging isn't really contemplated in this rule specifically, but we acknowledge that infrastructure is going to be needed to move forward consistent with the ramp up in the availability of the vehicle technology.
So going forward, will rules be promulgated that relate to these various issues? I mean, this is just one of the issues. I am sensitive to the needs that are being expressed by people who are concerned about the effect on their personal lives. So are you looking to promulgate rules that would address the issues that are being brought up? And for example, the person who wrote the letter, a single mom with kids, and she's got a car, and that's her lifeline. Are you writing rules about communications, public engagement, moving forward to ensure that distribution of charging stations, incentives, and so on are included?
So we have not, and I don't believe we have any plans to promulgate rules specifically related to siting of charging stations or distribution of charging. A lot of charging stations are built by private vendors that the state, and there's no public money going towards those that the state really has no control over. But in terms of spending the public funding that is appropriated to the various agencies that are deploying that money, in some instances, the legislature has set forth criteria for the agencies that we work with to implement that funding, to allocate it so that it's in line with, geographical siting concerns, equity concerns, As I said, we have a new multi-unit dwelling charging program that obviously is geared towards assisting people who don't have a garage and don't own their home, but still would like to own an electric vehicle and charge that vehicle, on the premises in which they dwell or close to that area. So these are all criteria and initiatives that the legislature has put forward and that we're implementing, but I'm not aware of any specific rules that will guide that other than the programs that have been incorporated into like the transportation bill and other.
This is Rachel Stevens. I just want to mention that we did address these concerns in the responsiveness summary. There's a whole section related to the state's plans for EV charging and deployment. And a lot of that is led by the Agency of Transportation, which has a national plan to implement, the millions of dollars that is coming in to the state from the federal government. And also includes some information about some of the other charging and incentives. So, ANR was very aware and coordinated with those other agencies in making sure that those plans are in place. And we have, articulated some good information in the responsiveness summary to address some of the concerns about some of the planning that's happening at the state level.
And sorry, council had something on our behalf to contribute.
Rachel provided sort of the most of what I was going to say, but in terms of the NEVI money, that's the federal money, the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure money, and I want to say Vermont gets like $21 million over the next few years. And there is language in the T-bill providing the match for that. In order for the state of Vermont and all the other states to be eligible for that money, they needed to produce a plan, and that plan has been approved as it was submitted, I believe, by the Agency of Transportation. So they're going to be able to start implementing that plan. And that's in addition to what Megan has talked about with the multi-unit dwelling money, which is separate and apart from that highway network plan, which is consistent with, I might get these numbers wrong, the state's goal is to have a fast charger within 25 miles of another one on designated highway networks and within 1 mile of exits from highways to spread across the country.
And the Agency of Resources doesn't directly implement those funds, but we participate on an interagency group. And that interagency group also participated in all of the public meetings that we hosted throughout the state. So we had representatives from V-Trans at every meeting. We had representatives in public service to address the grid concerns when we did our kind of roadshow across the state. So that's definitely a coordinated approach, and we're very aware of that.
So, as we're going through and talking about all of this, and obviously to support our greenhouse gas reduction goals and to mitigate the effects of climate change, the question about market competition versus public investment and regulation is very high on the list. And what, if anything, are the manufacturers doing to maintain a level of affordability for electric vehicles for lower and middle income people?
So I can try to tackle that one. We do expect that the cost of electric vehicles will go down as demand continues to increase and they make up a greater share of the new vehicle market. There is a component of the Advanced Clean Cars rule that actually incentivizes auto manufacturers to produce vehicles that are more affordable and to also invest in companion policies that a state might implement to make clean mobility more affordable for more citizens of the state that is adopting the rule. So that allows an auto manufacturer to earn credits towards compliance if they invest in these kind of more equity geared programs. So that's it.
So, but those credits are in the form of some public dollar investment?
Yes, they will. That is a possibility that they could earn those credits in return for making investments in areas where Vermont identifies there is a greater need to implement the rule more equitably.
Okay. But there's nothing nationally or in the California standards or anywhere else that looks at any kind of price regulation based on inflation. Oh gosh, we don't want to talk about inflation today, but talking about sort of median income available in a specific area. There's nothing about that in any of this conversation.
That's correct. This rule does not directly address any kind of price controls, but as I said, it does incentivize auto manufacturers to make this type of vehicle technology more available to lower income communities.
Well, I mean, that certainly explains why manufacturers are more excited about it than they might otherwise be. But to another comment or question I would have is, what efforts are you making to look at, this would be in connection with the Agency of Transportation, to look at the collection of funds to maintain road repair in our state. I mean, some of the work that we've done in the past have looked at working with manufacturers to have different plug types and different plug-in types for different types of vehicles so that some tariff can be collected whenever charging takes place. But I don't know if that's just one possibility, but are there any conversations going on as a result or embedded within the rules and then within the work that you're doing that will ensure that as we transition to electric, we are going to be keeping our transportation fund whole?
Yes, Senator Lyons. The VTrans was charged with conducting what's called a road user charge study. And I believe that road user charge basically means like the fee that you pay to use the roads and bridges, which is currently collected via the fuel tax. And I believe that they concluded that study and will be making a recommendation to the legislature based on the results of the study this year. So I don't want to steal their thunder, but that is definitely a very active conversation. The Agency of Natural Resources participated in that road user charge study working group. And I believe that will be a discussion that will be forthcoming during the legislative session.
Well, I would hope so. And is it your understanding that the manufacturers are involved in that discussion as well as other states?
We've certainly, it's my understanding that the Agency of Transportation and the contractor that they worked with to conduct the study used models that other jurisdictions are either pursuing or implementing to replace the gas tax. But I'm not sure if manufacturers were specifically involved, but we can reach out to VTrans to find that out.
All right, thank you. Thank you for that. And
Anthea might know.
We have the recognized counsel.
So I can add to that a little bit. Yes, what Megan said was correct. The Agency of Transportation did do this road user charge study. I think the direction, and again, not to steal their thunder with what the recommendation is going to be more in line given with how many people charge at home, something that's more akin to a fee that's calculated based on miles driven between inspections of your vehicle. Some of the other states are doing a more technologically advanced version of that with sort of a fob that will track where miles driven to account for miles that are driven outside of the state. But there have been many, many, many conversations, particularly in Senate Transportation, about the sheer logistical difficulties of collecting a per kilowatt hour tax at the point of charging, especially given how much charging is done at home. And it could be, in Senate Transportation liked using the word hybrid here, it could be that there's a hybrid model where there is some combination of a fee that's collected based on miles that are driven, but to account for miles that are driven by people from outside of Vermont in the state that do contribute to wear and tear on the roads and a loss of transportation fund revenue, having there be something at public charging stations that would maybe be more like the per kilowatt hour tax. So it is definitely a conversation that I have heard many, many times in Senate Transportation, House Transportation, and House Ways and Means.
Yes, thank you. Yes, and I did introduce a small amendment a few years ago that was looked at in transportation about that. But just one last question, and maybe as a couple questions. I am concerned about our electric infrastructure and ability to support the vehicles. And so the calculations for our state have been done. Can you just elaborate a little bit about the ability of the state to meet the electric demand over time as a result of increased electric vehicles?
Yeah, so that was certainly, we received many comments of that nature, Senator Lyons, and I'll just reference page 16 of the responsiveness summary, which goes into quite a bit of detail about those grid impact concerns. And I will fully own that obviously that is not the Agency of Natural Resources area of expertise, so we consulted and worked closely with our colleagues at the Public Service Department to answer these questions. But you'll see in those responses that there is quite a bit of planning and forecasting that is required of not only ISO New England, which is our grid operator, but also the electric utilities themselves. And what just the kind of the abridged version is that in the short term, we don't foresee any serious challenges to meeting the increased demand from not only vehicle electrification, but also electrification of buildings and from a heating perspective, but that there will, load management and other management considerations will need to be incorporated more heavily into future planning to ensure that further down the road, the impacts aren't felt by consumers. And then I'll also just note that there is quite a bit of funding available in recent federal legislation to help the Department of Public Service and the Public Utilities Commission consider specific infrastructure upgrades to our electric grid in anticipation of the move towards electrification, not only in transportation, but in thermal as well.
I'll take off my chair's hat just to contribute based on committee testimony we've had in the last couple of years on this issue. And that is, so the integrated resource plans that every utility is required to bring forward on a 3-year basis also include like a 10-year look ahead. And that I think everyone is very aware of the potential for growing loads, which has generally been called beneficial electrification, not just for the environmental benefits, but for the ability to have a larger load over the existing system and remove some rate pressure by, and also through things like load shifting. So if it's overnight charging for a grid that's generally under deployed from 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. or something like that. So I think there are a lot of people working to make smart use of the resources we have and to do smart planning about potential future loads. We also have tier 3, which is, it's not part of this conversation, but there are utilities out there looking to support electric vehicles as both a sort of a way to meet their tier 3 obligation as well as a business opportunity for them. So I think I just wanted to contribute that. So I'm cognizant of time, and we do have 2 other witnesses. So Senator Lyons, do you have any other questions you wanted to?
Oh, thank you. That was all very helpful. Thanks.
Okay, great. Here's one other natural resource chair comment I'm thinking of. When we talk about affordability, I think for years now, it's Burlington Electric, but it's their versions, varieties that are around the state. It's the equivalent of 62 cents a gallon gasoline these days to be charging an EV in Burlington Electric territory because of their rate and because of their tariff. I think if you're not participating in that program, which allows disruption of charging, I think the rate rises to something in the order of, $1 a gallon equivalent. So I'm just offering that up as reassuring data that when well managed, it can actually deliver benefit to those who need transportation and need to fill the tank, whether that's with electricity or gasoline. Representative Odie.
I'll wait.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We'll be here if you have any other questions.
I'll be here. I guess I'll hold on for later. I want to congratulate you for doing the work you have done. I have other issues that transcend all of this conversation, but I want you to know whatever I say later on, if I get that chance, given the time we have, It has nothing to do with what you guys have done. You've done stellar work, given what you've had sent to you by us.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to, so committee, I'd love to see us, we talked about running long today. And so let me check in now with people in the room and the committee. If we go to 12:30, is that possible for members of the committee?
We're already scheduled to go to 12:30, aren't we?
Well, just checking, we might end up needing a little more time than that, but
I agree.
we good on 12:30? All right, so that leaves us 35 minutes at the moment, which just, we're in a little bit in giddy up mode. That's okay. So with that, I'd like to turn to Mr. Kidd, who's on our witness list for this morning. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you all for the time and hearing on this information. I apologize for not being in person, but I've been faced with a bunch of illnesses with my family. So being cautioned, I don't want to spread anything to you all. So,
we appreciate that.
Yes, I'd prefer to be in person to see you all personally, but I'm in Montpelier still. But anyway, so on behalf of our members in Vermont and thousands of other Vermonters concerned about addressing climate change, we want to give our full support towards these rules. I personally think that the Air Quality Division has done a phenomenal job engaging the Vermont public on these particular rules, explaining it, even explaining things where a lot of people have questions, because as you all have heard, there are a lot of questions around this particular issue and how we're going to adopt. But I remind you, this is all about phasing everything in. And I see this as all consistent with what the legislature has already done, has approved, and even the governor has stated back in September that his, he believes we should rapidly wean ourselves off of internal combustion engines as quick as possible. So even you have the Public Utilities Commission Chair, Royce, who stated we should have a warlike effort to address vehicle electrification. So I see these as all consistent within our existing policies that we should be moving forward to follow through on this. In my submitted letter, I basically kind of gave you where I saw that the legislature already has authority granted to the administration to do this particular work. So it's not just the Global Warming Solutions Act. There are current emission laws allow us to proceed with that. So I think we should all look into the whole entire record of whether the legislature has granted you the authority. And consistent with that, you've seen how much money and investments on low emission vehicle incentives through either Mileage Smart, Replace Your Ride, or the EV incentives that you all have committed. Now, important also to note the EV infrastructure, how much of investments we're doing. And as I heard in testimony about the work about the multi-unit dwelling. Well, we also pushed for workplace charging, where a lot of Vermonters spend most of their day. But also to note, 90% of charging occurs at one's home. So we're not going to need to have completely flooded everywhere. It's not going to be like a gas station on every corner like we've had in the past. Everybody can charge. Now, there are concerns about development on that, and I think all the utilities are on board about moving it. The Public Utilities Commission, the Department of Public Service, is moving forward onto that. But I also want to comment about this. There's always a lot of fear about how much is this going to cost. Well, the study by the Union of Concerned Scientists, which I know they've added some documents to the public record, have basically stated in rural communities, this could be a benefit for us, not a negative. And that's what I think we all have to look at, how this is going to help people in our communities. And you question why it would be a benefit? Well, right now, out of every dollar we spend on gasoline, 85 cents leaves the state, 85 to 90 cents leaves the state of Vermont. Comparative, we purchase electricity here in Vermont, 65 cents stays here. So it helps keep the money generated within the local economy, creates jobs, helps people transition a way of sending our money out of state and even out of country. So it's something that we need to look forward to, the positive investments. A lot of discussions haven't been even occurred around health conditions. I have a family member who's been diagnosed with asthma recently, and she doesn't smoke at all, never has, and had never been really around that. So where is that coming from? 40% of Americans live in what we call dirty air. That's basically from tailpipe emissions. And so we need to actually transfer out of that just for our health costs. How much is it costing in human lives? And our health system. So, so basically in summation, I just want to reiterate the Sierra Club's support and the majority of the environmental community and a lot of Vermonters who came out in droves in support of these particular rules. And I'll take any questions from any of you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Kidd. Any committee questions for Mr. Kidd? All right, thank you for waiting patiently. Thanks for your testimony. I'd like to then move to Mr. McCormick. So, Mr. McCormick, we see your name up on the screen, but we don't see you, or when we don't hear anything yet, just in case you don't know how you're coming across in this room. Are you with us? All right. So, Mr. McCormick, if you're trying to connect, we can't tell. I also see a second phone line up that ends in, I think, zero. It's a little far away for me to read that. 066. I don't know if that is you, Mr. McCormick, also dialing in just to have an audio line with us. But that line is on mute. So the person who is dialing in with whose phone number ends in 066, could you just identify yourself?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes?
I'm John McCormick.
Okay, so we got that sorted out. It is your turn, Mr. McCormick. Please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you give me just a moment, I'll get set up here. Yes, I'm John McCormick, and I'm director of the Louise Diamond Committee to Protect Next Generations. That is a project of the International Monitoring Committee in Arlington, Virginia. It was founded by the deceased Ambassador John McDonald and co-founded by Louise Diamond, who was also a brief resident of Bristol. Before I begin, I want to congratulate the Addison County delegation on their election victories. Addison County is really represented by a strong group of delegates, and we're very proud of them. The ANR and its capable staff achieved a milestone in the rapid evolution of electric vehicles entering the new industrial revolution. Sales jumped 70% in the first 9 months of the year. Same period, conventional cars and trucks fell 15%. Manufacturers are investing billions to expand EV and battery production. Is concern about global warming pumping the increased sales? It appears not. It's about $6 diesel fuel. It's about $5 gasoline. Midterm candidates did not include global warming in their campaign brochures. It's 19th to 20th on the national concerns list. Lower and middle income Americans don't have the disposable income to spend $30,000 to $60,000 on an EV to help the environment. Nor do they have the disposable income to continue paying $6 or more for diesel. That should be the new narrative as the program moves forward. Play to the energy insecurity families are suffering in this chaotic global market. Your legislators will eventually own Vermont's inevitable shift to EVs as your mission. It can only happen with your participation at each step. The next decade will see Vermont legislators dealing with many costly next steps in this undeniable shift away from internal combustion. I congratulate our governor's approach to this shift. My F-150 will eventually be traded up to an all-electric. Vermont's government is leading in a responsible way. If Vermont shut the door to fuel imports today, the 33,000 tons of CO2 from that gasoline combustion, that mitigation would be eclipsed by China's 15 billion tons annually of CO2 in about 12 days. You see the narrative focusing on climate change as a reason for this new rule. It is playing into the hands of those who would say, yeah, but what about China? Changing the narrative to protecting people's ability to be mobile in this chaotic world market of oil. Despite state, federal, and utility incentives, the Northeast Kingdom citizens have not taken advantage to the degree that Chittenden County buyers have. Your approach to potential low-income EV buyers should ensure that no one will be left behind in the rollout of EVs. That's critical. Clean car rule should not become an all hat and no cattle. Using the 2020 census and DMV data, I created EV ownership in each county. Comparison of Chittenden County and the Northeast Kingdom paints a stark realization that wealth is the trigger mechanism to move someone to shift to an EV. Example here, Essex County, in the last 10 years, all electric vehicles, 4 purchases. Chittenden County, in the last 10 years, all electric vehicles, 1,434. There's no benefit to shifting to EVs for lower income and poor credit Vermonters if they cannot afford to buy one. The future is fewer used ICE vehicles and fewer gas pumps. Their children's future will be shaped by the infrastructure you legislators authorize and appropriate. We have the wealth today to build that infrastructure for our children and give them the comfort to help them adapt to global economic and security challenges by relying on EV batteries charged by renewable energy sources in Vermont. This rule is the beginning of that adaptation. We are giving drivers the option to pay regulated rates for the electricity or rely upon NATO and U.S. allies to protect us from sanctioned oil and oil embargoes. Vermont's government must ensure that no one is left behind. That is critical to this rule's success. And this rule must succeed. And here are a few statistics for context. Vermont has 400,000 registered vehicles, 98% burning gas. U.S. has 4 million, same category. And the world has 4 billion internal combustion engines. Mean average global temperature is now 1.2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial, and we're beginning to see the effects of that all around the world. It is likely going to a 1.5 degree increase about the time that the rule takes full effect to the car market. There's going to be more warming and extreme weather events. This rule cannot change that. More important, it can prepare our children to adapt to it. Education may come hand in hand with the numerous financial incentives. The rebate and incentives programs offered by federal, state, and utility are like a Rubik's Cube of choices and tax benefits. The buying process must be simplified, and state funds may be required to inform buyers how to qualify for additional support to make the sale. Little Vermont, acting as a city on a hill, can show that decarbonization can take place effectively in a small rural state. We will be part of a similar efforts in New England across the nation. We may be a small part of a small corner of the world, but maybe we can light the way for others to follow. Convince them of the economic wisdom of shifting to EVs and build the electric highway they will need to buy the car using incentives matched to their family budget. And on that note, legislators, I implore you to really focus on the needs of these counties, Essex, Caledonia, and understand what that budget of the average citizen means to the potential they will buy. It's agreed that they just can't afford. The state is going to have to step in and make up the difference. And I wish you all the best. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. McCormick. Any committee questions for Mr. McCormick? Okay. One thing I just want to share is that, as is often the case, when I'm a member of this committee and acting as chair of a committee of jurisdiction, I'll have questions. I want to hear the testimony before I sign off on behalf of the committee. And so just so that the committee knows, I've signed off on behalf of Senate Natural Resources and Energy today. And one other note, I'm hearing equity and concerns around cost and equity come up. So again, I'm taking off the chair's hat and just speaking as a committee member. We passed an environmental justice bill this year, which puts front and center the need for us to be attentive to and implement measures that help our energy transformation to be move forward in an equitable way. And I think it will never be a complete work. And this is a long phase in of new rules around transportation. And I think my numerous conversations with the Agency of Natural Resources tell me that they are very genuinely and deeply committed to advancing environmental justice in the state of Vermont, particularly as it relates to the work that they do. So there's probably almost nothing more personal than talking about people's cars and transportation. And that comes right down to how you get to work and all the rest. So, I'm looking forward, I hope, to an approval of this rule, because I think there's a need for us to act legally, environmentally, and I would even say personally, morally, as I think about impacts for future generations. And I hope that we move forward on it today. So there, I'll take off, put it up back in the chair's hat and leave editorializing aside. Any other committee conversation or questions around this rule?
I'll jump in for a second. And, the reality is that this, the role of this committee is to look at whether the rule implements the statute in accordance therewith. And I think it pretty clearly is. I'm sensitive to the concerns raised by Representative Higley, but I also have faith that price is coming down. I'm also, as more and more electric, frankly, this is almost an academic discussion because the world is going electric anyway. And it's going to happen whether we do it in an orderly fashion here in Vermont through the confines of this rule and the Global Warming Solutions Act or not. The vehicles are going to be electrified. And so I think that I also have faith in the legislature to the extent it's necessary, and probably will be necessary, to step in at some point and make adjustments along the way. But really the issue for this committee is whether the rule implements the statute. And the Global Warming Solutions Act is law, it has requirements. So therefore, I'm prepared to, I've really found the discussion today really worthwhile. I'm glad we had it. And I understand where everybody's coming from, but in the end, does the rule, is it consistent with statutory intent? And I think it pretty clearly is. So I'm prepared, I'll make a motion to approve the rule as presented.
So Representative Bongard has moved that we approve Rule 22P21. Is there any further committee discussion? Senator Benning?
I'm not exactly sure where to begin other than to say, as I'm about to leave my legislative role, I sort of feel like I have license to say things I shouldn't be saying. Part of my frustration here is our decision to go down the road of a Global Warming Solutions Act that transferred the conversation from goals to mandates. So when I hear even today legislators saying we have these goals, we don't have these goals, we have mandates. And it is very disingenuous for any of us to leave the impression that these are somehow things we can tweak at some point in time. As I said when we had our original Senate conversations on that subject, I absolutely believed we had no ability to meet the new mandates. We already had not met the goals that were anticipated. And as a result of not being able to meet the new mandates, I was horrified that any person, not even a citizen of the state of Vermont, frankly, would have the right to sue us and then place into the hands of a judge the decision about what we would have to do as a result of not meeting them. I am somewhat alarmed to hear that a judge in Massachusetts has now done just that. I have every reason to believe we are going to be in the same boat. Now, having said all that, let me back up another mile. I am not a climate change denier, not by any stretch. If anything, I learned in 1973 at the height of the OPEC strangulation of America that we should get off of fossil fuels as a function of our transportation fleet. I am very sympathetic to moving forward to electrifying our transportation fleet, as well as doing something completely different with our home stock. Having said that, I have never in my 12 years in the legislature seen a conversation that does not belong in Montpelier. This roughly 3 inches thick document that we are looking at in conjunction with the next rule to talk about, if there was ever a conversation that was supposed to be having at the national level, this is it. Right off the bat, it targets automobile manufacturers, and there are none in Vermont. I hear the words incentives. I hear the words, we can take care of things for people who can't afford this impact. I should also lay a foundation here that I do represent Caledonia District, which is one of the more rural and poorest in the state. I have every reason to believe, having purchased my last 3 vehicles in Littleton, New Hampshire, that there will be people buying used automobiles because they can't meet the expectations of an electric vehicle. And that seems to me to thwart the very objective that we are trying to achieve here. I have great admiration for the administration's work here in trying to develop this rule. Fundamentally, I remain absolutely opposed to the impact it's going to have on the citizens that I currently represent. I have no other way to say that. And I know I'm saying that at the risk of, should I be involved in a future political run of any kind, somebody's going to accuse me of being a climate change denier just because I vote no on this rule. I have a lot of concerns about the ability moving forward, as the federal dollars have evaporated, of the state's infrastructure being able to be supported by state dollars. I have yet to hear of what the new transportation proposal is on trying to get dollars out of people who are using electric vehicles. Love to hear what that is, because it's going to add to the cost of whatever is on the table for the people in my district. I have every concern that if the federal government is not the one leading this conversations, automobile manufacturers could tell Vermont to go pound sand if they wanted to. But that doesn't alleviate the concerns of the constituents that I represent. I have heard broad sweeping conversations about the need to change Vermont's air quality. I would have to remind those who make those broad statements that Vermont still has, if not the best, some of the best air quality in the nation. And so using that as the presumption for tiny little Vermont to have to go forward with these rules. I believe we do lack the infrastructure. I heard the Sierra Club making a statement that things could be adjusted and made easier for those in rural communities. I have yet to hear what it's going to cost. I know I saw it somewhere in the proposed rule, an estimate on what it would cost for a rural household to bring in a 220 line into a garage if it exists. But I think that's very problematic for those who are in the rural communities who are living paycheck to paycheck. And I don't see the state of Vermont coming up with support to get them modified over. So I guess in total frustration, although I appreciate what the administration has done, I look at this as if we ourselves in the legislature have created a situation which is bound to fail. Even with the best of intents, that we are going to end up facing lawsuits that are going to leave it to judges to tell us how we're going to be living our lives. And I really do object to the nature of that proceeding, and I don't know how else to express that other than to vote no on this particular rule.
Okay.
I've talked long enough.
Thank you, Senator Benny. As a member of another committee, I would just say briefly that the air quality data, there are sections of the state where I think it's surprising how compromised that air quality is. And there's reason for concern around NOx, for instance. There's also a program currently underway to underwrite the costs of bringing greater transformer, service line, and panel upgrades to homes, so that as people electrify, the cost of that electrification would increase the electrification is being addressed. Is it a perfect solution for all situations? Not yet, but I think it's been identified and is being worked on and is being invested in. So there's a lot of unknowns. The last thing I would is they're already, when we worry about the state of Vermont being sued, that is a current reality. Forget Global Warming Solutions Act. The failure to regulate is the basis for bringing action against the state for failing to regulate whatever law we're talking about. So I don't know that this is really new territory. It's just that GWSA has become sort of a poster child for concerns over suits. The last thing I'd say is there's a legislature that will be sitting, and many more of them during this long transition period. And if I would think every legislator in those future legislatures will feel just as concerned as we are about trying to make it a fair, just, affordable transition, and will have the power of statute, which will, in some cases, eliminate the need for anyone ever going to court to ask for relief. The last thing is one of the methods provided for CSA is to basically send the question back to the agency, the administering agency, to do rulemaking. So, which then again engages the public in the process of developing a future remedy. So I'm less fearful of court-imposed solutions and sanctions based on that.
Christopher, I'm going to just come back at you. You and I have known each other for a long time. Can we at least agree that this conversation is a place, it should be held in the halls of Congress, not in Montpelier? The best place for China to get the message they've got to start correcting behavior is not from Montpelier, it's from Washington.
As much as I wish that we could agree on something, and we often do, I would say for me personally, no, I feel like the obligation to act is front and center. It's our obligation. And I feel like this is us being responsive to that obligation. For me, I agree. A global solution would be far more powerful, but I feel like this is Vermont making its best effort to do its part. So
we'll have to agree to disagree. I think we're crossing over from the place where we're punching above our own weight to
yes,
ourselves in the face.
All right, so there is a motion made by Representative Bongartz to approve Rule 22 P21. Is there any further are we ready? Well, is there any further committee discussion? Senator Lyons, sorry, I'm belatedly seeing your hand up there.
That's okay. I really would like to say that I would, while Senator Benning's idea of having the federal government weigh in on this and help us make these changes nationwide and then carry these decisions globally, at this time, I can't even fathom that our Congress in its current state would be able to reach any consensus as we have with the rules that are before us. So I would ask us to please vote. Thank you.
All right. Any further discussion? Okay. So thank you, everyone in the committee and in the room on Zoom for a healthy and thoughtful discussion. Just a pivot point and a long transition. With that, all those favoring approval of the rule, please say aye.
Aye.
Okay. And all those opposed, please say nay.
Nay.
Okay, so the rule is approved by a vote of 4-2. Thank you, everyone, for your contribution. We have some additional work to do today in order to sort of put our house in order in terms of moving a rule forward and addressing its repeal elsewhere in law. So with that, I'd like to turn to back to A&R to fill us in on Rule 22P20. Good morning again, Ms. Stevens.
Good morning. I'll just jump right in. My name is Rachel Stevens, and I'm an Associate General Counsel of the Agency of Natural Resources representing the Air Division at the Department of Environmental Conservation. And today I'm joined by staff from the Air Division. John Wakefield, who's joined remotely, is the Compliance Section Chief for the Air Division. And also Dave Shepherd, who's here, is a environmental analyst, and I offer them as kind of technical experts in this area to answer the questions. Today, ANR is proposing amendments to air pollution control regulations related to wood heaters. ANR is updating the framework for control of emissions from wood heaters to promote more efficient and economical appliances and to reduce harmful air contaminant emissions that cause or exacerbate serious health conditions. These proposed amendments, as you've heard, include an administrative amendment to remove subchapter 11 of the air pollution control regulations related to the low and zero emission vehicles, which is being repromulgated into a concurrent rulemaking as the new Chapter 40 of the Department of Environmental Conservation rules. This rulemaking was just approved by this committee. Currently, under the air regulations, Section 5204, Section 204 applies to new wood stoves and central wood heaters for residential and non-residential use that have a heat output of 2.5 million British thermal units or BTUs per hour or less. Wood heaters that are subject to this section need to be certified by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency pursuant to the new source performance standards for residential wood stoves and central heaters to be sold and installed in Vermont. Currently, wood heaters that have a heat output of 7 million BTUs or greater are required to apply for a permit pursuant to Section 5401 of our regulations. These proposed amendments aim to close the gap for wood heaters of the size between 2.5 and 7 million BTUs by amending the threshold for EPA certification for the smaller units, adding a new size category for mid-size or medium-size wood heater units, and lowering the size threshold for wood heating installations that need to obtain an air pollution control permit to be constructed and operated in Vermont. Act 50 of 2019 requires ANR to adopt these amendments being considered today and to incorporate alternative compliance mechanisms into the requirements for the medium-sized wood heaters to allow manufacturers and installers to have more flexibility to comply with the rule. The agency has met those obligations and included those alternative compliance mechanisms and allowances into the rule that's before you. The proposed regulation is intended to apply only to new installations or substantial modifications of larger size existing installations, and existing units installed prior to the effective date of these amendments are not subject to any additional requirements at this time. Prior to beginning the formal rulemaking, A&R engaged a robust group of stakeholders to review a pre-rulemaking draft of the rule in 2021 and other technical support documentation. A&R also held a pre-rulemaking stakeholder meeting in 2001 that was attended by wood heater sellers, installers, manufacturers, air quality consultants, and air quality advocacy organizations. We have continued to stay in touch and engage with these stakeholders throughout the process and hosted a public meeting on the proposed rule in September of this year. A&R did make changes to the proposal based on public comment, and I'd just like to quickly walk through those minor changes, which have also been noted in the responsiveness summary, which you have in your packet. First, the agency updated the proposed rule in section 5205B1 to clarify that wood fuel burning equipment that was previously certified by the secretary pursuant to the interim compliance process under Act 50 will retain that certification, meaning it will not expire unless the air pollution control officer determines that recertification is necessary to avoid a nuisance or to protect public health and safety. Second, I should just mention there were two appliances that were approved in this interim process. Second, the agency made a typographical edit to the definition of unseasoned wood, which is in section 5204. It previously in the codified rule said of, and it should have said or vice. I messed it up. It should have said or, and it now says of. Either way, it's correct in the proposal. Third, the agency amended the definition of distribute or sell in section 5101 to clarify that it does not apply to wood fuel heating equipment that is installed outside of Vermont. This was a question that came up in the public process. We also made a typographical edit to 5205 to use the term distribute or sell instead of the term sold or distributed. So we just changed the tense of the word. Last, the agency updated the proposed rule in 5205 to clarify that if certification is being sought for equipment that's burning multiple types of wood fuels, then a compliance test would need to be conducted for each of the fuels that's going to be burned in the equipment. I'll stop there. Our team, as I mentioned, is available to answer questions. We have our technical staff from the air division here. So I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Committee, any questions for Ms. Stevens or any member of the A&R team?
Just have a question about the unseasoned wood. Again, that doesn't fall for residential homes that have current wood heat systems, does it?
I think you mean the definition of unseasoned wood?
Right.
I think that would apply. Are you following that? Yeah, Dave.
I'm Dave Shepard, I'm environmental analyst with the Air Quality Division. When we amended our current rule in 2016, that definition was inserted at that point. So it would apply to units that were installed after 2016. And it's actually a federal requirement as well.
So that's units that were installed after 2016. But what about prior to that? I mean.
No, it wouldn't apply to those.
Okay, so, okay, that's an important note for me anyway, for sure. And I guess one other question is, I mean, I would maybe like to approve the wood heat rules, but you combined it with dissolving the other rules around clean car standards or the federal guidelines around clean air standards. Why was that?
So under our interpretation of our ability to amend the rules under the Administrative Procedure Act is that we can't amend the air pollution control regulations on two different cycles. So we couldn't initiate an amendment to the wood heater rule and then concurrently also amend the air pollution control regulations to introduce or amend the Levin-Zev rules if they were at different cycles. So we had always intended or thought about removing the Levin-Zev rules into a separate chapter because they do need to be updated more frequently. And this gives our agency the ability to update the air regulations as needed to comply with federal law or to make other changes while also updating the Levin ZEB on a separate chapter. So it was more of we call it kind of the air traffic control issue that, and it did kind of create an issue because we were directed to update the wood heat rules pursuant to an active legislation, but also had another competing deadline to amend the regulations for Levin ZEB. And so that was us wrestling with the timing. So that's why we've done it this way.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This is a sort of a leftover question from our last discussion.
Sure.
So we've been operating, as I understand it, since 1995, under the California Air Resources Board paradigm for cars. And we were talking about the ability to monitor, adjust, et cetera, along the way. Do you, I don't mean to ask a surprise question, but I guess I am. Do you have any knowledge of how many times or how often we've had discussions and then amended our rules because we have the ability to do that, in the last 27 years? Is this a once in a decade thing or a more regular process?
Well, so certainly it's been amended as to stay compliant, but I'm not sure if we've ever amended based on do you know?
Well, Anthea actually pulled up a really helpful history of every single time we've amended the clean car rules. I don't know if you but I
don't think that's every time that it's been amended. It was just the early 2000 one.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, I guess it's I don't know. I know we've certainly amended it many times to stay consistent, but I'm not sure if we've ever seen the percentage requirement or seen, adjusted based on, looking at the market or where the manufacturer is.
Sure.
But we could find out.
I will add the Secretary of State's office, if you go and you look at the version that's posted through LexisNexis for a rule, you'll see at the bottom of it, much like in our statutes, there's that legislative history section. Yeah. But because these rules are all part of this bigger set of rules, I don't know if the Secretary of State's office would be able to parse it out without looking to see what the name of the rulemaking was and if it said wood heater or cars or something like that.
All right. So, but for this particular adjustment, along the lines of what Representative Higley's asking, this is really a housekeeping division so that the two rules can be revised, adopted, et cetera, independently.
Right. We didn't want, needing to change the Levin ZEB rules to somehow delay other air quality management work that we do to update our regulations in these other fields. And it is, our air pollution, as you can see, because you have it printed out in front of you, they're enormous and cover a large body of different sources. And so this is more of an efficiency and kind of a housekeeping thing that we're doing to make it more efficient to maintain our air quality regulations.
Okay. Are there any further committee questions or for Ms. Stevens or her colleagues? Any further committee discussion on the rule itself, 22P20? Right. The chair would welcome a motion to.
So moved.
Okay, so Representative Odie has moved that the committee approve Rule 22P20. Any further committee discussion prior to voting? All right, hearing none. All those in favor of approval of Rule 22P20, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, please say nay.
Nay.
Okay. Senator Benning, I was busy keeping track of my own paperwork. I didn't hear where you were.
An aye.
An aye, okay. So 5-1 for committee vote. Thank you. And thank you to whatever team. I don't want mean whatever team ANR. I know it's a very big team. A lot of people work on these things. We see only sort of the tip of the iceberg when you come over here to help us work our way through them. So thank you to you and everyone. I know there's a lot of work behind these two massive rules that you've moved forward today. With that, there's two pieces before we adjourn. One is, I think, for the committee to request formally of our council to draft a letter to committees of jurisdiction based on the rules we were discussing earlier, namely the collection rules, well, it's really part 2, 22P15, and the level of care that we had. So if you could perhaps work with Senator Lyons and bring a letter to the committee for next meeting, that would be great. So I don't know if we need a motion when we ask for a letter.
I think you normally request it now and then you move to approve the context of it when you actually see it, which will be at December 1st.
Great. Thank you for that helpful reminder. Anyone have anything else they would like to offer on the letter that we're requesting? The other piece of work, our fastidious senator from Caledonia County has pointed out that the minutes omitted a piece of information. Can you remind us what was missing, please?
There
Senator
was
Benning?
nothing at the end of the minutes to indicate we had actually moved to adjourn. And
Okay.
Thea and I exchanged a note that said, since she's been on the board, we've never had a clause indicating that we have adjourned, which is conflicting in my mind with my distinct recollections, may in fact predate you, but I recall distinctly seeing Representative Myers has moved to adjourn at the bottom of all of our minutes, and I don't know where we stopped doing that.
So I can go back and check, but I can also start including it going forward, and it can be your final, or there are a few more meetings, but it can be one of your final contributions to LCAR.
We're going to talk about that before we get out of here, when our next meetings are.
Okay. Representative Bodie.
I would just hope that you could look to see if Mason's actually requires a motion for adjourn.
So I think it's not included in the minutes because it isn't actually required. I don't think you need the motion to adjourn, which is why it's not been included in the minutes, but you could include it in the minutes. It has been the practice of this committee to always have that motion to adjourn for 2 years plus.
So whether memorialized in minutes or not, Senator Benning, would you like to do the honors?
I would like to see us actually memorialize the fact that we adjourned, so it doesn't look like we're in session in perpetuity. Because the beginning of the minutes actually do say we have declared the meeting open at 10 o'clock or whatever the case may be.
Okay. So then a motion would be in order.
Could move to adjourn. Unless you had something.
Well, I would like to say that if Mason's does not require it, then the minutes could just say the meeting was adjourned. And the chair can adjourn the meeting. So I am uncomfortable with saying that we would have to have a motion to adjourn if Mason's allows adjournment by the chair.
Okay. So how about this? It hasn't caused us to lose much sleep so far. I'll move that we adjourn. Between now and the next meeting, we can do a little more research and people can make a pitch next time for which way we proceed at future meetings.
I don't think we need to lose any sleep, Chris. I'm just suggesting at the end of the minutes, there should be some notation that we actually stopped working.
All right. So
I mind that.
Right.
I do mind entering into,
So going forward, I will say the meeting adjourned at, we'll say 12:45.
Right. So
chair adjourn the meeting.
So thank you, everyone. No, and I'm not teasing you at all. I think it's very helpful to have lawyerly precision when we're doing our work and recording legally binding, the minutes of legally binding actions. So I'm not giving you a hard time at all. But so let me just check in. Is there anything else members of the committee would like to address today? All right. Hearing none, the meeting is adjourned.